Chapter 194. Su Songzi stayed in Xiao Wenjing's office. Previously, she had listened in on the interrogation room, which was actually a bit against protocol. However, she still had another case on Su Lu, and her relationship with Xiao Wenjing had always been good, so the district prosecutor's office didn't make things difficult for her. Next to the office was the hall of the district prosecutor's office's second section. The staff were busy with the case at hand, but the sudden sound of excitement still made many people raise their heads. Su Songzi looked over curiously through the glass. She didn't know what evidence these inspectors had found. "Inspector Xiao, the car has been found." A middle-aged official in his 40s looked at Xiao Wenjing and said happily, "It's in the night parking lot at the side of the courtyard. I didn't expect that kid to have no intention of destroying the evidence at all." The murder on Hushan Road involved 2 active officers in the Shell Motor Company. The matter was very troublesome. Under pressure from certain parties, the district prosecutor's office intercepted the case as quickly as possible. The most important thing at the moment was, of course, to collect evidence of Su Li's involvement in the case. The black car that was testified by witnesses to have stopped on Hushan Road was naturally the most important thing. Xiao Wenjing's spirits were lifted. She took out a box of biscuits and chewed on 2 pieces. She quickly asked, "Has it been sent to the forensics department?" He paused for a moment and said, "Directly scan it with fluorescent light. Even if the car was washed, there should still be blood stains on it. Also, tell the guys in charge of organizing the cleanup to be more careful. The car was found half an hour ago. It went straight to the forensics department." Xiao Wenjing drank a mouthful of tea and smiled. She thought that as long as the evidence was found on the black car, the young second lieutenant with a background would never be able to escape. However, the development of the facts was always the opposite of what the investigators thought. After 10 minutes, the excited middle-aged staff member from before pushed open the glass door with a sullen face. He walked to Xiao Wenjing's desk and lowered his voice. He said in a strange tone, "No evidence was found." Xiao Wenjing moved her gaze away from the files on the table and slowly stood up. She stared at the subordinate in front of her, indicating that she didn't understand what he said at all. Even if they couldn't find the knife in a car that had been left behind by the suspect in the parking lot, there should be some traces of the victim's blood left behind. With the current technology of the Federation, they could find even the tiniest trace of blood. The other party did a very professional job and carried out a thorough cleaning. You can even say that this black car is now a new car that just left the factory. The middle-aged official lowered his head and said dejectedly. Xiao Wenjing noticed the words professional, and couldn't help but sink into silence. The higher-ups were putting a lot of pressure on the district attorney's office. They were determined to turn Second Lieutenant Su Li's case into an ironclad one. With his good relationship with the higher-ups, he even knew where the pressure came from. However, he didn't have any conflicting emotions. This was because during the previous interrogation, he had confirmed that Su Lu was the murderer. Who was helping Su Lu destroy the evidence? To be able to clean a car with a complicated structure in such a short period of time without leaving a trace, why didn't such a powerful force directly destroy the car? Xiao Wenjing's brows furrowed like a distorted Chinese character. He took a deep breath and waved his hand to have his subordinate leave the office. He lowered his head again to look at the files on the table. There were no traces of the victim's blood on the suspect Su Li's body. It was said that before entering the military prison last night, he had changed his clothes. And before he was locked up, he even used the military's powerful cleansing powder to carry out a thorough cleansing. Originally, he was just a little regretful that the military prison's cleansing had destroyed the direct evidence that the district attorney's office might have gotten from Su Lu. Now that he thought about the black car that could no longer be used as evidence, he couldn't help but think, could it be that from the beginning, there was another group of people in the government secretly helping this suspect get off the hook? Could it be the Ministry of National Defense's Deputy Minister Zhou? Xiao Wenjing looked at the pictures of the crime scene on the table. Suddenly, he angrily slammed the table. The teacup shook and fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. The sound alarmed the staff outside the office. They all looked over with concern. They didn't know why their boss was so angry. The detention center behind the district attorney's office was filled with serious criminals. These criminals had already been interrogated by the police and sent to the district attorney's office to await trial. Some of them were sent back by the court for additional investigation. The lights in the detention center were bright, and the surveillance facilities were complete. Also, it was deep behind the district attorney's office. There had never been a prison break. The defense work was basically handed over to the electronic surveillance network, so there weren't many people. There were no beds in the room, only 2 rows of benches connected to the high-strength plastic wall. Su-lu sat on one of the benches and calculated the time. Then, he turned his head and used his finger to write something on the wall. However, he couldn't leave a mark, so the other prisoners in the same room couldn't see it. The data is already in my hands. Next, I need to wait for the Thai family's response. Then, I need to enter the engineering department and create the new generation mecha. At the same time, I need to finish modifying the simulation system that I want to use. Then, I need to find a way to implant my own control program into the prototype mecha in the warehouse. Senator Macklin is already in cahoots with the Iron Calculator family. His campaign funds are abundant. If Dean Lin from the Federal Academy of Science continues to support him, then Pabre's side will be in trouble. If I can make the Federal Academy of Science lose face during the research on the new mecha, then their alliance will be much weaker. I think that Dean Lin won't have the face to stand on the political stage again. After the assassination, the Thai family wasn't willing to deal with Senator Macklin directly. That was because there was no evidence. Moreover, the rules of the game between the upper echelons of the Federation are like this. If Senator Ross and Senator Macklin really become the president, then the most I can do is get my hands on a mecha. What use can it be? Su-lu silently wrote on the wall. Ever since that firework display, he had cried in the cafe of the 1st Military Region's living area. The smile on the young man's plain face had decreased a lot, and he had become much quieter. No one knew what he was thinking in his heart. Tai Ziyuan didn't know. Shi Qinghai didn't know. Zhou Yu didn't know. That mysterious and omnipresent Thai family also didn't know. Only he himself knew. He had been waiting for a certain moment. If the laws of the Federation didn't satisfy him, then he would become the law himself. This was an arrogant and wrong idea, but Su-lu persisted. The arrest of the young second lieutenant of the Husk Institute didn't attract much attention at this time. No one knew that at this time, he was repeating the plan that he had been repeating for half a year. That plan that seemed a little whimsical. The district prosecutor's office questioned him 3 times. Other than the first time, when Su-lu said something, he remained silent for the rest of the time. He watched as the minutes and seconds passed. It was already late at night. He seemed calm, but in reality, he was beginning to have a strange feeling in his heart. Could it be that even with the wisdom of the madam of the Thai family, she couldn't understand what kind of impact the Federal Academy of Science would have on the voters if they were biased in the election? Or could it be that the political power represented by the Thai family had determined that the Academy of Science had already obtained the data and didn't believe that they still had the capital? Right at this time, the lights in the corridor suddenly dimmed. The night sky outside the window mixed with the faint moonlight and sprinkled into the cell. The atmosphere in the cell that had been silent all day suddenly became strange. There were 6 people in this cell. Other than Su-lu, who had been silently pondering, there was another person who had also been silent. That person was still silent. Other than him and Su-lu, the other 4 people stood up and walked towards Su-lu, who was in the corner. The person in the lead had a fierce face. He was about 1.85 meters tall. His arms were hanging by his side like they were cast from iron, swinging non-stop. That person lit a cigarette and looked at Su-lu with a gloomy and cold gaze. A buzzing sound was heard. The 3 surveillance cameras around the cell suddenly turned off. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and looked at the surveillance camera. He seemed to have understood something. Although he had never been in prison before, he was still an orphan. He didn't know how many times he had heard from Li Wei about the black prison. That big guy laughed silently and smashed his fist towards Su Li's head. The other people around him also pounced at the same time. It seemed like they wanted to beat Su Lu to death. Su Lu stood up. His feet moved quickly within the small space on the ground. He struck the armpit, elbows, knees. His movements were extremely fast and clean. He fiercely kicked the lower abdomen of the person beside him. That person groaned and was kicked 3 meters away. He fell heavily onto the plastic wall. Before he could fall to the ground, he vomited blood and fainted. He turned around and blocked the big guy's arm. He raised his arm and elbowed the guy's sternum. The big guy was like an iron tower that lost its balance. With a crack, he collapsed under his feet. In less than 3 seconds, all the people surrounding him fell to the ground. The big guy's sternum seemed to be broken. He kept breathing heavily and blood seeped out of his mouth. The people on the ground looked at Su Lu as if they were looking at a monster. They couldn't even get up, let alone attack again. Su Lu took out a cigarette and lighter from the big guy's body. He sat back on the bench and silently lit one for himself. After thinking for a while, he took out a cigarette and threw it at the guy who had been silent the whole time. Between the 2 of them, the 4 prisoners were still tossing and turning in pain. They desperately wanted to get as far away as possible from the terrifying guy Su Lu. The big guy painfully held onto the edge of the bench next to Su Lu. He wanted to crawl further away, but the pain in his chest made him lack the strength. He could only resign himself to his fate and lean against Su Li's side. He took deep breaths. I didn't know that the Federation's laws allowed the prosecutors to use such despicable methods. The guy who had been silent the whole time took Su Li's cigarette and put it next to him. He forced a smile and said, "I don't understand what you mean." At this moment, the lights in the corridor lit up. The surveillance camera started to work again. The door of the cell opened. The guy looked at Su Lu cautiously and left the cell under the protection of a guard. Su Lu didn't move. He sat alone on the bench and smoked the cigarette. His 2 fingers that were holding the cigarette were slightly trembling. If the situation didn't change by tomorrow morning, it meant that the Tai family, who could change everything, didn't want to directly go against the Li family and the Federal Academy of Science for something that they didn't need. Then he had to think of a way himself. He lit another cigarette, lowered his body, and put it in the big guy's mouth. Chapter 195. Inspector Xiao, your method is useless. That guy doesn't look like a civilian soldier at all. He took down 3 in one move. The guy who had been silent in the cell was a staff member of the District Procurator General's office. He stood in front of Xiao Wenjing and hesitated for a moment before saying, "This is illegal. What if someone finds out? I've never asked you to do this before." Xiao Wenjing rubbed his throbbing temples and turned his head to look at the capital's night view outside the window. "Don't worry. If anything happens, I'll take care of it for you." Xiao Wenjing had never used such a despicable and shameless method before. The capital planet's media was well developed, and the people were vigilant. The people in the judicial system had always done things appropriately and properly. However, Xiao Wenjing was under too much pressure from above today. Plus, he knew that Su Lu was the murderer, but he couldn't find any direct evidence at the moment, so he had to use the old method from decades ago. Despicable methods were often the most useful methods. Unfortunately, this method didn't seem to have any effect in front of that young second lieutenant called Su Lu. I shouldn't have untied the plastic ropes on his hands and feet in the first place. Xiao Wenjing's eyes turned cold. As an excellent inspector, he had seen all the crimes in the Federation. He wasn't someone who got angry easily, but for some reason, he got angry easily when facing that young second lieutenant called Sulu. He didn't know where this anger came from. Maybe it was because he knew that the other party was the murderer but couldn't find any evidence. No, Xiao Wenjing often encountered this kind of thing. He should be angry because of that young second lieutenant's cold-bloodedness. No, cold-blooded psychopathic murderers weren't rare in the Federation. What exactly am I angry about? Xiao Wenjing was shocked and fell into silence. She gradually understood. What made him angry was that it was obviously a simple case, but because of the pressure from his superiors, he had to use some illegal and despicable means. This situation made him feel angry. He took a sip of the strong tea and felt the bitterness on his tongue. After a moment of silence, he said, "Since they are making trouble in the cell, then tie up the hands and feet of the suspect." Today, for the sake of the murder suspect, he had already cooperated with Xiao Wenjing to do something illegal, but he didn't expect that his boss would still insist on it. If this matter was known by his superiors or the reporters, not only would the reputation of the district prosecutor's office be ruined, but the involved Inspector Xiao and himself would never be able to stand out again. He subconsciously wanted to disobey this order because it was illegal. As an inspector, he had enough reason to refuse and could even report it to his superiors. However, because of his trust in Inspector Xiao Wenjing and his close cooperation with the second section, his reaction was a bit slower. At this moment, an inspector pushed open the door and came in with news that dispelled his worries. It was the middle-aged inspector who was in charge of the black car identification during the day. He looked at Xiao Wenjing with a strange expression and said, "Inspector Xiao, the case on Hushan Road, someone has turned himself in." When Xiao Wenjing heard this, his hands pressed weakly on the table. With his intelligence, he naturally knew that the forces trying to protect the real murderer had begun to counterattack. However, he didn't expect that the other party's counterattack would be so despicable and despicable. Using a scapegoat was a boring method that could only be seen in mafia movies. Did the other party think that this would make the district prosecutor's office give up on the investigation of the vicious murder case on Hushan Road? However, Great Inspector Xiao had forgotten that he had previously used despicable methods that could only be seen in mafia movies. The entire Federation's judicial system was already somewhat unfamiliar with such despicable methods. Moreover, he should also be clear that such despicable methods were often the most powerful. He supported himself on the table and tried to control his anger, but he found it more and more difficult to control it. He even felt that slamming the table heavily was not enough to express the emotions in his heart. Throwing a teacup. One had already been thrown during the day, and now there was only one left in the office. The person who came to turn himself in was a hooligan from the slums of Wangdu. Looking through the glass window at the hooligan's indifferent expression, Xiao Wenjing knew that this scapegoat was the kind of scapegoat she was most afraid of. This kind of scapegoat didn't care about anything as long as they got money. Going to jail was the same as going home. Nowadays, there weren't many death sentences in the Federation, but there were quite a few hundreds of years in prison. Although the case involved the murder of an active Federation officer, from the mouth of the hooligan, a ridiculous accidental conflict and manslaughter story was made extremely smooth and flawless. Someone must have taught him this. Xiao Wenjing silently looked at the image in the interrogation room through the monitor. She watched as her subordinates used all kinds of methods to intimidate but to no avail. If she investigated from behind this hooligan, even if she investigated more than 70 levels, she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to find the real mastermind. How did the other party pick up the knife and wear the bloody clothes of the real culprit? It was obviously the supplies distributed by the federal military. How did it end up with the hooligan? She found an excellent reason. Of course, there were many loopholes in the entire case, but other than admitting to manslaughter and handing over the bloody clothes, the hooligan kept his mouth shut and didn't say a word. The most serious situation was that since the power behind the real culprit had already made a move, the pressure that should come would naturally come. It definitely wouldn't be as simple as just one person. This was where Xiao Wenjing's worry lay. As expected, he immediately received a call from his superior. In a subtle tone, he was asked to quickly close the murder case at Hushan Road, comfort the victim's family as soon as possible, and give an explanation to the Nutshell Mobile Company. There are loopholes in this case, and there are suspicious points. I have to continue investigating. Xiao Wenjing was unusually stubborn. You can investigate, but shouldn't you release the second lieutenant? If you can find any other evidence in the future, just bring him back, the dignified voice on the other end of the phone said coldly. Xiao Wenjing slowly hung up the phone, and a self-deprecating smile appeared on her face. Previously, when she received the call from her direct superior, she was also under pressure. However, that pressure was from arresting Su Lu and speeding up the investigation. The pressure now was from a completely different direction. Comfort the victim's family? Bullshit. On the morning of the third day after the murder case at Hushan Road, Su Lu walked out of the district prosecutor's office accompanied by the female officer, Su Songzi. Looking at the fresh sunlight, he didn't feel much joy in his heart, only calmness. The Tai family's action was slightly slower than he had expected, but he didn't expect the Tai family to act so quickly and accurately. They helped him eliminate all the evidence of his crime and personally sent a scapegoat to the district prosecutor's office. Just thinking about that scapegoat made Su Lu unable to feel happy. As one of the 7 great families of the Federation, these things naturally didn't need to be done by them personally. Everyone had their own realms, and the competition and killing of those lower powers were very far away from them. They only needed to express their attitude, and naturally, someone would do it. The sunlight was a bit blinding, and a cold and angry voice suddenly sounded beside Su Lu. Can you sleep peacefully at night? Su Lu turned his head and looked at Inspector Xiao Wenjing beside the stone pillar outside the district prosecutor's office. Looking at her haggard expression, he was silent for a while, and then suddenly said, "In the entire Federation, no one sleeps more peacefully than me." Xiao Wenjing was slightly stunned, as if she didn't expect this person to still be able to act so righteously and with a clear conscience at this moment. She said mockingly, "Including after killing someone?" "Those who want to kill will naturally be killed," Su Lu said. Inspector Xiao Wenjing seemed to have caught some information. She narrowed her eyes and said, "Unfortunately, you won't tell the truth. Because I still have a lot of things to do." Su Lu looked at her and suddenly asked, "Do you think you stand on the side of justice?" "I stand on the side of the law." Then from the very beginning, the district prosecutor's office shouldn't have gotten involved in the Hushan Road case at all. Su Lu looked at her and said, "Since you couldn't resist this kind of pressure from the very beginning, then you should know very well that what you want is only performance and promotion. It has nothing to do with justice or the law. I'm very sorry to say what's on your mind." Su Lu turned around and walked towards the black car at the bottom of the stone steps. Behind him, Inspector Xiao Wenjing fell into deep thought after hearing these words. "I don't know the details of this murder case, but I think, no matter what, you can't be considered on the side of justice." Su Songzi, who had been silently following him, suddenly spoke when he saw Xiao Wenjing's somewhat lonely expression and then glanced at Su Li's calm face. "I know you think I'm the murderer." Su Li's hand touched the handle of the black car. Without turning around, he said, "I used to respect the law as well, but later, I discovered through the facts that the Federation's laws are ineffective against certain people, so my respect for the law also faded. I also gradually understood that there is no reason to speak of in this universe. Since that's the case, I can only insist on what I think is right. It has nothing to do with justice." Su Songzi silently looked at his side profile. She clearly knew that he had brutally killed an active Federation officer the night before yesterday, but for some reason, she couldn't link this person to a cold-blooded criminal. She would rather believe that there was more to this matter, but unfortunately, Su Lu was unwilling to say. "Oh right, the crime of destroying the core secrets of the Federation. Because you have the rights to the laboratory data, additional investigations are being carried out. You will temporarily be placed under residential surveillance and won't be forcibly detained." Su Songzi laughed self-deprecatingly. She thought about how the Federation's laws that she had studied for so many years were actually so weak in front of these invisible existences. She said lightly, "Congratulations, if there are no accidents, you shouldn't be sent to the military court again." Sulu softly said thank you to her, then sat in the back seat of the black car. The black car drove away from the busy entrance of the district prosecutor's office. Su Songzi hugged the case file in her arms and quietly watched the black car disappear around the corner. She silently thought to herself, what exactly does this young officer have to attract the attention of so many powers in the Federation government? This definitely isn't just related to Deputy Minister Zhou. After leaving the district prosecutor's office, Sulu knew that the Tai family had started to make their move. Since the murder case could be reduced to nothing, then naturally, the problem in the nutshell laboratory could also be suppressed. He didn't know how they did it, but he was thinking about what they wanted him to do next. "Madam is waiting for you." A middle-aged man sat in the driver's seat of the black car. Sulu silently looked at his back. For some reason, he thought of Butler Jean. Chapter 196. Not many people in the Federation paid attention to the Hushan Road case because the media did not report on it extensively. Even the independent media of the George faction that was most willing to expose the dark secrets of the Federation was silent on this matter. Logically speaking, under the tens of thousands of years of the First Charter, the rate of criminal cases in the Federation was not high, especially such vicious cases. Moreover, the suspect and the victim were both young officers from the Federation Shell Motor Company. There were too many articles that could be written about this case by the reporters. However, whether it was because the case had happened too recently or the reporters had too little information, or because the district attorney's office had kept a tight lid on the case, the news did not spread widely. Now that a reckless hooligan had confessed, the young second lieutenant involved in the case had left in a relaxed manner, and the Hushan Road case would naturally be gradually forgotten. Similar to this case, many people knew that the Shell Motor Company Research Institute laboratory had been smashed by someone with an axe. For the Federation, the data that could affect the development of the new generation of mecha was obviously much more important than an officer who had just entered the federal military. However, this matter involved the secrets of the Federation, and no news media would touch this red line. Yesterday morning, the laboratory that had been smashed to pieces by Su Lu had been completely sealed by the military police. Immediately after, the core data inside had all been transferred. It was not difficult for the Federal Academy of Science to obtain access to the central database. On the surface, the data was still quietly stored in a remote room in the Husk Institute, but Su Lu and many people involved in this matter knew very well that the people in the Federal Academy of Science had already obtained the data. Unfortunately, no one had evidence to prove the actions of the Federal Academy of Science, just like how the district attorney's office had no evidence to prove that Su Lu had committed murder, or like how Dean Lin of the Federal Academy of Science had plagiarized Professor Shen's research results many years ago. The Free and Fair Federation was indeed just a slogan. Outside the high-amplitude particle laboratory of the Federal Academy of Science and Technology, Secretary Luo was on the phone with someone. He maintained a smile on his face as he responded to the other person's thanks, but his eyes were looking inside the laboratory. After the call ended, Secretary Luo did not rush into the laboratory to report this important call. Instead, he stood quietly by the door and looked at the nervous professors and researchers in the laboratory. The high-amplitude particle laboratory of the Department of Technology was a large-scale laboratory that Dean Lin had applied for a large amount of funds from the Federation Management Committee to build. The department head of this laboratory and the researchers were all very outstanding and capable. Through the filtered glass, Secretary Luo looked at the crowd in Laboratory Area 3. In the middle of the crowd, Dean Lin was sternly scolding something. He knew that the data from the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute had now been quietly transferred here. With the Federal Academy of Science's powerful research and development abilities, it would not take long before the key problems of the Federation's new generation of mecha would be solved. The Federal Academy of Science and Dean Lin, who was in charge of this research, would once again receive the praise and respect of all Federation citizens. As for Professor Shen and that young assistant researcher who had actually created these things, one was already dead, and the other was already marginalized. As long as the final results were out, who would remember the process? Moreover, the other side had already promised that they would definitely not let the young second lieutenant speak carelessly. Secretary Luo frowned slightly, but he did not understand. The other side clearly knew that once the research of the Federal Academy of Science was successful, Dean Lin would personally come to support the election of Governor Ross and Senator Medellin. Why did the other side not seem to care? The noise in the laboratory had come to an end. The leader of the Federation's academic community, Dean Lin, walked out with a serious expression. Secretary Luo followed behind him and said in a low voice, Secretary Shen called to express his gratitude. Secretary Shen? Wasn't the previous secretary by Madam's side surnamed Jean? Asked Dean Lin with a frown. The new young secretary. Apparently, Madam likes him very much. On the top floor of the Sanlin United Bank headquarters building in the capital, Secretary Lu quietly walked to Li Xiuzhu's side and said softly, Su Lu has been released. Secretary Shen just called to express his gratitude. Li Xiuzhu quietly looked at the street outside the glass and did not speak for a long time. He did not mind sending that young second lieutenant named Su Lu to prison for life, even if that young man seemed to have a strange relationship with Deputy Minister Zhou of the Ministry of National Defense. However, he had no choice but to let go today. This situation made him feel bad. He could look down on that mysterious young master of the Tai family, but he had to respect the madam of the Tai family. Even if the pride in his bones made him unwilling to let go after receiving the call from Secretary Shen, his father's call from afar extinguished all his courage to challenge the other side. The Crown Prince's friend? Li Xiuzhu laughed. His handsome face was slightly cold. Even Secretary Shen acknowledged this relationship. I have to give this face. It seems that I still underestimated that guy named Su Lu. Macho Mountain was the most secluded mountain forest in the suburbs of the capital. This area of green hills and tranquil gardens was originally the garden of the royal family. During the Third Constitutional Era, it was designated as a national park by the Federation government. District S1 had a large population, so the area of the wildlife reserve that the Federation used electronic walls to encircle was much smaller. However, it still took up half of Macho Mountain. After a few areas were cut, there were not many empty and quiet places. The tourists that came to this mountain only paid attention to the beauty of the mountains and rivers. They had long forgotten the faint royal atmosphere of this mountain park. In the deepest part of Macho Mountain, there was a large area of forest surrounded by fences hidden in the grass and cliffs. The tourists could not see the scenery inside. They only thought that it was an obstacle to prevent the dangers of the mountain road. They did not know that there were thousands of acres of forest inside that belonged to an ancient and mysterious family name in the Federation. The black car steadily followed the mountain road to the end. An inconspicuous iron gate blocked the front. After passing through the iron gate, one could faintly see the depths of the mountain. At the end of the flowing water, there seemed to be a few small buildings that were built in picturesque disorder. It was indescribably beautiful. Su Lu pushed open the car door and stood in front of the iron gate. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the small buildings in the distance. Macho Mountain was very close to the capital. This manor hidden in the mountain had such a large area. In addition, he had read a lot of books. After learning about Tai Ziyuan's background, he had crammed in the history of the Federation. He knew that this mountain was originally a royal garden. With the Tai family's status and history in the Federation, it was natural for them to live in this mountain. The iron door slowly opened, and a man in his 30s wearing a dark suit in the late spring came out to greet them with a smile. This person first nodded at Su Lu and then said a few words to the driver in the black car. Su Lu was slightly surprised. He knew the man in front of him, but he didn't expect that he would appear here. Mr. Wang is the madam's personal driver. He has served the Tai family for many years. The man smiled at Su Lu and said, "The madam rarely uses her personal car to pick up people. I think that other than the president and the war god, there shouldn't be many people who can receive this kind of treatment." This kind of subtle expression, coupled with this person's polite and slightly distant smile, was not repulsive. Su Lu looked at him with a smile and said, "Shenli." When they met at the base of the Black Eagle Security Company in Linhai, he easily recognized this secretary Shen. "I am the madam's secretary now," Shenli said with a smile. The Black Eagle Security Company was one of the 3 major security companies in the Federation. With Shen Li's age, he was able to become a senior manager of the Black Eagle. That day, under the instructions of Tai Ziyuan, he had full authority to command the operation in Linhai. He was already a very impressive person. However, in less than half a year, he actually became the secretary of the Madame Tai. Su Lu couldn't help but be a little surprised. Although Tai Ziyuan had already passed the coming-of-age ceremony, which was completed with his help, Su Lu knew very well that the real power of the Tai family of the 7 major families in the Federation was still in the hands of the high and mighty Madam. The secretary of the Madame Tai, when put on the stage of the Federation, was enough to talk to a governor as an equal. Compared to the senior manager of the Black Eagle Security Company, this was undoubtedly a big step forward. "Madame Tai is waiting for us." A bicycle slowly came to the side of the two. Secretary Shen smiled and explained, "The madam doesn't like the smell of gasoline, natural gas, and liquid hydrogen mixed with the smell of chemical products, so all the cars in the park are electric bicycles." Su Lu nodded and didn't say anything more. He followed Secretary Shen onto the bicycle. The picturesque small buildings at the end of the mountains and rivers seemed to be very far away, but in fact, they were very close. It didn't take long for the electric bicycle to take them to the front of the small building. On the right side of the small building was a long corridor. The corridor was covered with long green vines. The new leaves were like jade, and the yellow flowers were just blooming. Looking through this long corridor, a small dam could be seen not far away. The mountain stream of the back mountain was blocked by this dam many years ago, and a small Xiaoping lake in the mountains was formed. The small building was under the mountain forest, by the lake. Walking along the stone steps towards the deep courtyard, Su Lu lowered her head slightly, but her ears were listening to the sound of the mountain wind blowing through the forest and the lake rippling. She was not surprised to feel that there were many people hidden in the surrounding forest. She could not see any of the Tai family's security personnel with her eyes, but she could hear and feel that his pair of knife-like straight eyebrows slightly raised. Noticing that he was listening, Secretary Shen's footsteps slowed down slightly and immediately returned to normal. His lips slowly released a smile, and he felt a little surprised by Su Li's attentiveness and ability. The 2 men walked to the second-floor terrace of the small building deep in the courtyard and naturally stopped. Su Lu took a deep breath and made his expression as calm and gentle as possible. Even if he was really a stone, he was still nervous knowing that he was about to meet such a big shot as Madame Tai. There was a parasol on the terrace. Under the parasol, there was a small white table, a few plates of pastries, a pot of tea, and 2 women. Chapter 197. The most powerful person in the Federation was, of course, President Sieg. The Vice President, the Chairman of the Federation Management Committee, the Director of the Federation Investigation Bureau, the National Security Advisor, and the Director of the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation. These were all important figures who stood beside the President, who stood at the pinnacle of power in the Federation. The chief executives of the various regions, as well as the governors of large states like Ross, were all people of low status. However, the one with the highest prestige in the hearts of the Federation citizens was the old man from the Lees of Philadelphia. Outside of the political structure of the Federation, the 7 great families were hidden in the shadows. However, they possessed sufficient power to stand up against these important figures mentioned above. This was especially true for the Zhong family from the West Woods, who had been stationed at the edge of the universe for generations. They were akin to warlords. The Tai family was the most mysterious and low-key of the 7 great families. All these years, the leader of the Tai family had always been a woman. Ever since she got engaged to the previous head of the Tai family at the Double Moon Festival Ball at Yue University, that woman had been the most powerful woman in the Federation since she was in her 20s. Especially now that the Tai family was gradually stepping into the limelight, the existence of this woman was even more important. Every decision she made could possibly affect the future of the entire Federation. After becoming friends with Tai Ziyuan, Su Lu learned about the history of the Tai family and their status in the Federation. He had once been curious as to what kind of person this powerful Lady Tai was. After coming to the capital and entering the Nutshell prison, especially after being released from prison for the past 2 days, he had truly felt the terrifying influence that the Tai family had on the Federation. Thus, this curiosity had become even stronger. Sitting in a black car, sitting on an electric scooter, looking at the scenery of the lake and mountains, looking at the ivy-covered corridor, Su Li's mood didn't relax at all. This was because he knew that he was about to meet that woman. He kept guessing in his heart what kind of person Lady Tai should be. No matter how he thought about it, he couldn't figure it out. Until he came to the balcony and saw the woman smiling as she watched Zhou Yu's wrist movements under the parasol, he suddenly understood that Lady Tai should be like this. Because of the passing of youth, she appeared ordinary and peaceful. There was nothing special about her. No matter how the people in the Federation guessed, Lady Tai looked like this, and this woman was Lady Tai. Secretary Shen politely pulled out the chair next to Zhou Yu and gestured for Su Lu to sit down. Then he went to Lady Tai's side and pulled the chair to the back. He sat down quietly and didn't care about the blazing morning sun outside the parasol. He silently rubbed his hands and maintained a suitable distance from the 3 people under the parasol. Su Lu felt that his lumbar vertebrae seemed to be a bit rusty, and the movement of sitting down was somewhat difficult. It was clearly a scene of afternoon tea on the lakeside balcony, but because of the existence of the woman across the table, there was a trace of uneasiness in the atmosphere. This naturally wasn't because the afternoon tea had been moved to the morning, but because of the identity of the woman. This was the smell of power. After taking the teacup handed over by Zhou Yu, Su Lu subconsciously looked over and saw Zhou Yu quietly lowering her head to divide the tea. Every movement was so natural and graceful. Su Lu had seen many sides of this girl, but he never imagined that Zhou Yu would be so pure, so quiet, and so virtuous. After Su Lu took his seat, the lady across the table didn't say anything. Instead, she held a small teacup made of guna porcelain and slowly took a sip. She narrowed her eyes and looked at the lake below the terrace, as if she was thinking about something long ago. Su Lu was silent for a moment. He picked up the teacup handed over by Zhou Yu and took a sip. There was no food to eat in the district procuratorate, and he didn't drink much water in the morning. The key was that the air on the balcony had become a bit dry because of the smell of power. His throat was a bit dry and spicy. He finally understood why Zhou Yu was able to expose the political collusion behind the laboratory data the night before. A girl who often drank afternoon tea with Lady Tai, trained under this kind of pressure, shouldn't be a normal person to begin with. But this kind of tea was too depressing. Su Lu lowered his head slightly and put down the teacup. He thought to himself, could it be that Zhou Yu's coldness and craziness outside was because she was too suppressed in front of Lady Tai? In an instant, he thought of Lady Tai's afternoon tea. Many people in the Federation probably wanted to drink it, but couldn't. Zhou Yu drank tea with the woman for so many years. She had seen so many people and things. The woman across the table probably really liked Zhou Yu and wanted her to marry Tai Ziyuan. But now, Zhou Yu was an unmarried mother. The child in her belly was growing healthily, and his identity was that of the child's father. Thinking of this, Su Li's mood became a little strange. But then he thought about how Deputy Minister Zhou could see at a glance that he was taking the blame for someone else. The woman in front of him was smart enough to see that as well. Plus, he had called Tai Ziyuan from the very beginning to report this matter. Just as he lowered his head and pondered in silence, Lady Tai had already retracted her gaze from the lake. She smiled and looked at his ordinary face, but still didn't say anything. Su-lu put the teacup on the table and took a deep breath. He raised his head and looked back at her with a smile. His smile wasn't deliberate. It was just like how he used to be in the past. It came from his heart and appeared naturally and optimistically. Lady Tai didn't seem to expect that this young man, who came to see her for the first time, would have the courage to look her in the eyes. A faint glimmer of light flashed across Lady Tai's eyes, and the crow's feet at the corners of her eyes smoothened a lot. Just then, Butler Jean came to the balcony with a pot of coffee and poured a cup for Su-lu. Su-lu was a little surprised. He bowed and nodded in response. "Get a coffee." "This is Caspian caviar," said Lady Tai with a smile. "I heard that you like caviar very much, so I specially prepared some for you today." Su-lu was slightly stunned. He didn't expect this to be the first thing this woman said today. He was very familiar with the aroma of the coffee in the cup and the small plate of black, pearl-like snacks on the table. This was because many nights in the H1 section of the library of Linhai Lihua University, he would often exchange scallion pancakes and plain porridge bought from small stalls for Tai Ziyuan's coffee and pancakes. Lady Tai specially prepared this today because she had heard someone mention it before. Su-lu immediately understood the meaning behind Lady Tai's words. Secretary Shin sent people to bail him out of the district attorney's office not because the Tai family needed Su-lu, but because she valued the friendship between her son and him. Tai Ziyuan doesn't have many friends. "Other than Zhou Yu, you're the only friend I've ever seen," said Lady Tai with a smile. Su-lu took a sip of coffee and ate a piece of caviar to satisfy his hunger. When he heard this, he laughed. He believed that Lady Tai definitely didn't hear it from Tai Ziyuan himself, but from Butler Jean. After all, Tai Ziyuan should know very well that he didn't like this kind of weird-tasting, luxurious biscuit at all. "I heard that you used to be a soldier in Donglin district. When did you enter Yue University?" Drinking tea on the terrace was something that only the upper class of the Federation liked to do. However, different classes of celebrities gave off different vibes. Presumably, there weren't many people in the Federation who had the right to occupy half of the national park and become the backdrop for a tea party. However, no matter what kind of tea they drank, other than a very small number of people who drank alone, it was all a means of communication. What they drank was secondary, what they talked about was more important. Su-lu held his coffee cup and narrowed his eyes. The scenery of the lake and mountains entered his mind. When he heard Lady Tai's question, he answered quietly and politely, "Madam, I entered Yue University in the winter of the 65th year of the constitutional era." "Oh." "Back then, Tai Ziyuan's father and I also studied at Yue University." "How are the flowers in Yue Garden blooming now?" "Very beautiful." Su-lu answered, "I spent most of my time beside the iron gate of Yue Garden. I took a lot of photos. At that time, I lived in the girls' dormitory in Plum Garden." The ordinary-looking Lady Tai spoke normally. She didn't seem to be probing him. This high and mighty head of the 7 great families used the common point of Yue University to find the rhythm of the conversation. She smiled and chatted idly with Su-lu, diluting the previous atmosphere on the terrace. At this time, Su-lu was a little distracted. Only now did he remember that it had been almost 2 years since he escaped from Donglin district. As for Plum Garden dormitory, he had once waited for a young girl in the dormitory on a snowy night. The gossip continued. The high and mighty lady across the table didn't deliberately pretend to be approachable. She only looked at Su-lu calmly. The examination in her eyes was completely hidden by the shrewdness she had cultivated for decades. Su-lu also didn't feel like he was bathing in the spring breeze. He knew that the lady across the table wasn't a politician. She didn't need to win the favor of the voters, and she didn't need to maintain a friendly image. Today, he was able to sit on the terrace, basking in the mountain breeze and the lake light. It wasn't because he had the data from the laboratory as his capital, nor was it because he had a good relationship with Tai Ziyuan. It was because the lady across the table wanted to look at him for some reason. After the matter of Yue University was finished, Lady Tai stood up and left. Zhou Yu followed behind her. She found an opportunity to turn around and sneak a glance at Su Lu. She made a strange expression. Only Su Lu and Secretary Shen were left on the terrace under the parasol. Su Lu knew that the real conversation had just begun. Without the presence of the lady, he felt that the air was suddenly filled with a relaxed atmosphere. The scenery of the lake and mountains began to reveal its true beauty. Secretary Shen smiled at him and asked, "Do you still have the data?" "Yes." "When will you give it to me?" Chapter 198. Raising one's eyebrows or raising one's eyebrows didn't mean that he was angry or hostile. Little Lu knew very well that he had no reason to be angry or hostile on the terrace of Macho's back mountain. Thus, he smiled. It was not the kind of smile one would have when one accepted his fate, nor was it the smile he had when he was in front of Lady Tai. He was just smiling. Thus, Secretary Shen also smiled. He personally poured another cup of coffee for Su Lu and then sat back in his chair, quietly waiting for the other's reply. As Lady Tai's secretary, Shen Li understood the style of the 7 major families of the Federation very well. The Iron Schemer was not only referring to this family's meticulous planning, but also to the fact that this family planned before making a move, not leaving any benefits for the opponent. The Iron Schemer and the Federal Academy of Science had worked together, so the Tai family's reaction had been much slower to begin with. Thus, in the end, Secretary Shen did not believe that this young man in front of him had really grasped the data. However, since Madame believed, he could only believe. Su Li's mind was filled with many shocking things, but his personality definitely did not have such elements. After taking a sip of coffee, he raised his head. Previously, Madame Xian had only wanted to take a look at him. Right now, the conversation between her and Secretary Shen was about the actual details. And it was clear that Secretary Shen was a very busy person, and also a very direct person. Thus, he also very directly stated his conditions. "I want to face the mecha directly, and you all can't monitor me." He was not used to this kind of bargaining and scheming conversation, so he had laid out his bottom line right from the start. Secretary Shen frowned slightly, somewhat unexpectedly feeling a trace of possibility from Su Li's tone. From the start, under Madame's instructions, he had helped this young second lieutenant clean up any traces behind him. After that, he had personally made 2 calls to the young master of the Li family and the Federal Academy of Science. However, he had always thought that Madame was just doing a small thing for Su Lu for Tai Ziyuan's sake. Unexpectedly, it seemed that there really was some kind of benefit waiting for the Tai family in front of them. It was unknown what Secretary Shen said on the intercom, but a staff member walked up from the side of the balcony, carrying a large box. The staff member put the big box next to the table, bowed to Secretary Shen, and then quietly left. Secretary Shen placed the box on the table and opened it, then pushed it in front of Su Lu. The pure black keyboard and specialized data input device flashed slightly under the clear light of the lake. Su Lu was slightly stunned. He recognized that this was the Federation's most advanced integrated workbench. He understood why Secretary Shen placed the workbench in front of him. He pressed a button on the side of the workbench, called up the display screen, and then closed his eyes to think for a moment. During the 10 seconds of closing his eyes, Su Lu moved a part of the data model in his mind, once again confirming that the mysterious existence had indeed imprinted the data of the laboratory into his brain. He did not want to think about the mysterious existence, because at this time, there were clouds coming from the east, covering the scorching sun on the peak of Macho Mountain. The cool lake water caused the mountain wind to cool down the temperature. If he thought too much, he was worried that his scalp would go numb and he would feel fear. Opening his eyes, Su Lu began to silently operate the workbench. His 10 fingers moved quickly on the workbench as if he was playing the piano. From time to time, he would use both of his thumbs to operate the specialized data input device. Secretary Shen did not look at the display screen, but only stared at Su Li's eyes and the pair of fast-moving hands. 23 minutes later, Sulu somewhat tiredly retracted his hands. He rubbed his eyes, turned the workbench in the box, and pushed it in front of Secretary Shin. Secretary Shin quickly glanced at the complex data model on the display screen and did not look at it again. He smiled at him and said, "Take a break first." Everyone had their own field of expertise. The first military academy had nurtured many outstanding talents in the Federation for countless years, such as Shi Qinghai, Zhou Yu, and Xin Li. To be able to become Lady Tai's secretary, Xin Li was naturally an all-rounder. However, when it came to data models in the Federation's most advanced field of technology, he admitted that he was much inferior to Sulu. This workbench should be connected to a certain extent. The Tai family had specialized technicians analyzing the meaning of this data model, Sulu thought. A few minutes later, Secretary Shin slightly closed his eyes, as if he was listening to the sound of the communication device in his ear. A moment later, he slowly raised his head. However, the gaze he used to look at Sulu now was much more formal, much more serious. "It is very difficult for me to agree to your conditions just now," Secretary Shin said sincerely. "The development of the new generation of mecha in the Federation is a systematic project. Even if you have mastered the most critical technology, you cannot complete this project alone. This will require the cooperation of at least 1,000 engineers." Sulu listened quietly, his eyes fixed on the layer of white foam swirling gently in his coffee cup. No one knew what he was thinking. "I need a MX prototype mecha for research. Professor Shin's name must be on the Federation's list of manufacturers of the new generation of mecha." Sulu lowered his head, looked at the coffee cup, and said, "I did not hesitate to kill and set fire to the data in the laboratory. This is all for this. Why must you participate in this process? Other than the government, or in other words, the Shell Motor Company, no one else in this world can provide these industrial foundations." Secretary Shin stared into his eyes and said coldly, "The Tai family may be able to, but the Tai family has done so much for you without any benefits. This agreement is very difficult to reach. No matter how good your personal relationship with the young master is, it is still the same. I admit that I cannot change anything by myself. The development of mecha does indeed require the large industrial foundations you speak of, so if you want to compete with the Federal Academy of Science for time, I need to stay at the Shell Motor Company to watch closely." Sulu raised his head and said, "As for the issue of benefits you mentioned, since the success of the new generation of mecha in the Federation will affect the presidential election, then I think that from Madam's point of view, it does not matter who develops the new generation of mecha, as long as it is not Dean Lin. The Tai family does not need the false reputation of developing the new generation of mecha. They only need someone else to succeed before them." Sulu looked at Secretary Shin's thoughtful face and continued, "But my teacher really needs this false reputation. To be precise, other than the false reputation behind him, he can no longer enjoy anything else." Secretary Shin did not speak for a long time. He was probably calculating in his mind. Lady Tai had given him a lot of authority, but he had to weigh the pros and cons. Professor Shin's signature. "I can promise you, and I can tell you clearly that if you give me the data, the Shell Motor Company will still be the one to carry out the specific research work," Secretary Shin said calmly. "We have a certain amount of influence over the Shell Motor Company. Coincidentally, the Shell Motor Company does not have anything to do with the Federal Academy of Science." In the past, Sulu would have been shocked when Secretary Shin said that he could influence the Shell Motor Company. However, facing the terrifying power of the 7 major families of the Federation, he was already numb to it. He only said softly, "The data must be in my hands. In that case, can I go directly to the Shell Motor Company? Can you not go to the Shell Motor Company?" Secretary Shin suddenly said, "How about this? I'll arrange for you to go to the Whitewater Company. As for the data, I'll set up a direct channel. You can contact the people in the Shell Motor Company directly." The development of a new epoch-making mecha for the Federation was a great honor, and naturally also a great benefit. If Secretary Shin agreed to all of Su Li's requests, the Tai family would not be able to gain any advantage. However, For some reason, Secretary Shin suddenly gave in. Whitewater Company. Su Lu suddenly remembered that the first test of the prototype MX Mecha for the Federation seemed to have taken place at this Shell Motor Company. However, the problem was that the Tai family's strength should be at Black Eagle. Why would they send him to Whitewater? These past few days, you've caused too much of a ruckus in the research institute. In addition to the incident at Hushan Road, who knows how many pairs of eyes will be watching you. It's not suitable for you to stay in the Shell Motor Company's headquarters any longer, Secretary Shin said. The only place that can meet your requirements is the Whitewater Company, said Secretary Shin. The Shell Motor Company is definitely out of the question. If you appear in the Shell Motor Company, both the Li family and the Academy of Science will be wary. Su Lu was silent for a long time before nodding. Secretary Shin smiled and closed the black workbench in front of him. He stood up and shook hands with Li Du. When their hands touched, it meant that the agreement between the two parties had been reached. Su Lu did not express his gratitude to Secretary Shin for saving him from the district attorney's office. Secretary Shin also did not represent Lady Tai to express her gratitude to Su Lu for his performance at the Linhai State Gymnasium. Those matters were on another level. Secretary Shin suddenly looked at him and asked, I'm very curious about something. I heard that half a year ago, the Crown Prince personally invited you to join the Tai family. You never agreed. Why are you willing to cooperate with us this time? If I join the Tai family, I will be Tai Ziyuan's subordinate, Su Lu said with a smile. Cooperation is equal. Secretary Shin's smile became somewhat profound. This young man in front of him actually wanted to cooperate with the Tai family on an equal footing. What kind of arrogant and presumptuous thought was this? However, there was not a single trace of arrogance in the other party's honest expression. There was only a trace of absurd sincerity. Beside the window on the top floor of the small building facing the lake, Lady Tai silently looked at the lines of the lake. The lines at the corners of her eyes were like the things she had experienced over the years. They gradually accumulated and could not be undone. She quietly listened to the voices beside her. She did not miss any of the words that Secretary Shen and Su Lu said. When she heard the word cooperation, she could not help but smile. She could hear that Su Lu was not used to this kind of bargaining. She could also hear that this young man was immature and stubborn. She did not dislike this point. Instead, she felt that it was somewhat interesting. The metal in her hand was slightly cold. Lady Tai lowered her head and looked at the small tool in her hand. This was the small blue device that Su Lu had left behind in the Nutshell laboratory. Since the beginning, the Tai family's influence in the Federation had been secretly cleaning up for him under the instructions of this madam. They naturally did not leave behind this device. Chapter 199. Su Lu entered Yue University with Professor Jin's recommendation letter, but it seems like he doesn't know this himself. Butler Jin stood beside Lady Tai, like a pine tree by the lake, hidden in the mountains and rivers, undetectable. He said apologetically in a low voice, "About this, I've known about it for a long time, but because young master insisted on not informing you, so he did not finish his sentence." Lady Tai looked out of the window quietly, her hand slowly caressing the small device that emitted blue light. In the entire Federation, she was probably the only one who could see the wisdom hidden within this small device, as well as the man behind this wisdom. Seeing that Madame did not say anything, Butler Jean took a step back and stood in the shadows by the window. He was very clear about the story between the Tai family and Professor Jean. Although he did not know Professor Jin's true identity, he had served this family for so long that he could feel some of Madame's emotions. "Send someone to Donglin to investigate the incident that happened in the year 65, Lady Tai said softly. "This is too much of a coincidence." Butler Jean did not know what coincidence was, and Lady Tai did not mention it either. Today, only President Sieg, herself, and a few people in the Lees of Philadelphia knew the true identity of the defected mechanic, Yu Feng. And because of some of the stories from back then, she knew more about that person's identity than anyone else. From the beginning, Lady Tai did not believe that person would die so quietly. Now, she held the device that only he could make in her hands. Looking through the window at the young man he had recommended to Yue University, her heart gradually calmed, and she felt indescribably calm. The black metal door slowly closed behind the car. Su Lu sat in the black car, his eyes narrowed, as if his thoughts were still stuck in the beautiful scenery of the lake and mountains behind Macho Mountain. Today, the wealth displayed by the Tai family did not have the aura of wealth, only the aura of mountains and mountains. The mountains and mountains were picturesque, and this painting seemed to be in the heart of that madam. Su Lu was clear that after he came out from Macho Back Mountain, his life would be different again. However, he still stubbornly believed that he was only a small character, a commoner. Facing that picturesque landscape, he didn't feel the slightest bit moved, nor did he feel inferior. He only felt a slight pressure. The black car on the mountain road smoothly avoided the increasing number of tourists in the front mountain. Su Li's hands were firmly on the steering wheel. This car was the one he used to drive. Since the district prosecutor's office had already found him innocent, this black car naturally didn't need to stay in the forensics department anymore. Secretary Shin had already taken it out for him. Thank you. He suddenly smiled and turned to speak to Zhou Yu. When he left the back mountain of Macho, out of his expectation, Zhou Yu also left the mountain with him. He knew very well that after he sent Zhou Yu to the West Mountain compound of the Ministry of National Defense 2 nights ago, this girl must have told the whole thing to Madame Tai in the first instant. Su Lu didn't know that Lady Tai had already begun to suspect the relationship between him and that uncle. He only thought that if this girl beside him didn't help to analyze the situation and ask the Tai family to help at the first moment, then his life would be very difficult. He might really become a fugitive in the Federation again. Zhou Yu laughed self-deprecatingly, her hand gently stroking her belly. Her belly was already very big now. She was gradually approaching the life of a young unmarried mother. Her face without makeup looked slightly haggard and nervous. Her feet were a bit swollen, and she wore a pair of loose cloth shoes. Her entire person didn't have the slightest trace of coldness, only a trace of frustration in the tranquility. She slowly turned her head and looked at Su Li's smiling face. She couldn't help but tilt her head and wonder in her heart, what exactly is this guy's nerves made of? It's the first time you've seen Madam, but you can still be so calm. Su Lu, you've surprised me again, Zhou Yu said. Su Lu was silent for a moment, then said with a smile, I'm just pretending. Zhou Yu also smiled. Su Lu didn't say anything else, and focused on driving. On the mountain road, the black car's autopilot wasn't enough to be completely trusted. His gaze calmly stared at the winding mountain road, but in his heart, he was thinking about something else. He knew very well what kind of colossal power the Tai family was. In front of this family, no one could hope for the possibility of equal cooperation, even if he now had the only set of laboratory data in the Federation. However, Secretary Shin had nodded earlier, and the Tai family had even given up most of the benefits. This made him a bit confused. Earlier, when he was bargaining on the balcony, he had only clumsily put forward his own demands, but he didn't expect the other party to agree. Why was this? Late at night in the suburbs of the capital, the black car was like a ghost parked in the parking lot of Linyuan. After returning from Macho Mountain, Su Lu and Zhou Yu were led by the waiter into the restaurant. They had just returned from Shanshui and entered Shanshui again. In the afternoon, Zhou Yu had even invited Su Lu to walk around the famous scenic spots in the capital. He didn't know why Zhou Yu, with her swollen abdomen and swollen feet, had such a great interest in traveling and appetite. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the private jet that occasionally landed under the white cliff behind Linyuan, but in his heart, he thought of George Carlin's theories. George Carlin had always believed that the core of the unfairness of the Federation was that confidence was not made public. This was the so-called principle of class information asymmetry. Linyuan was originally the exclusive restaurant of the HTD Bureau of the Federation. Later, it was purchased by the Lin family, one of the 7 families of the Federation, with a large amount of money. The HTD Bureau was specifically responsible for enforcing the Wildlife Protection Act, and in the upper circle of the Federation, this restaurant was famous for its exquisite wild meat. The people of the Federation didn't know about Lin Yuan. Even if they had heard some rumors, they didn't know the specific details. In the Federation, as George Carlin had said, from the very beginning, there was no fairness between classes because of the asymmetry of information. Stepping into Lin Yuan again, was he no longer the orphan of Dong Lin, the fugitive of the Federation? Su Lu held Zhou Yu's hand and walked inside, but he felt a little lonely and lost. Madman Li has returned to Feicheng. You don't have to worry about anything anymore. Zhou Yu had lived in the 3rd military region since she was a child, and her family was not ordinary. Naturally, she didn't know how Su Lu felt at this moment, so she said with a smile. Beside the floor-to-ceiling window, there was a stream of water that flowed from the depths of the bamboo forest behind the table. Sitting quietly beside the stream, sipping the plum wine in the brown-red clay cup, smelling the delicate fragrance of the bamboo leaves in the water, and looking at the white cliff under the lights in the distance through the window, it was a great enjoyment. Similar to the first time they entered Lin Yuan, when the two of them walked into the hall, those hidden behind the mangroves, bamboo forests, and pear trees all looked at them seriously and curiously. Surrounded by these gazes, so you didn't feel uncomfortable at all. Instead, Su Li's expression became more serious. Sitting in the bamboo house with the best seats, it didn't take long for people to come over and greet them. Those were the people with good eyesight in the capital. They gently said something to Zhou Yu and asked her to say hello to Deputy Minister Zhou. In the end, they politely nodded to Su Lu and left. This happened 4 or 5 times. No matter how slow Su Lu was, he still felt that something was wrong. After a moment of silence, she confirmed that no one would disturb her meal. Perhaps the remaining guests in the Lin garden didn't have the status to come to their table. Only then did Su Lu let out a sigh of relief. Zhou Yu used the tip of her chopsticks to pick up a piece of stewed jade bamboo shoot. Looking at him, who was a little uncomfortable, she said with slight ridicule, "It's different from last time. These gazes are all on you. Those people who came over didn't come to see me, but to see you." The news spread so fast. Su Lu bent one leg and held a small wine cup in his hand. At this time, there was no one to disturb him, so his movements were much more casual. However, this posture was a little out of tune with the extremely elegant scenery around them. The news he was talking about was naturally about Secretary Shen calling a young second lieutenant in the Husk Institute. Only such news could make those people come over to talk to Zhou Yu. Their real purpose was just to see what kind of person that young second lieutenant was. There is no absolute secret in the Federation, especially when some people don't want to keep it a secret. Zhou Yu shook her head. "Madam asked you to bring me to Lin Yuan." Su Lu raised his head and looked at Zhou Yu. "Are you not used to it? You should know very well that everything is based on rules. Just like the Hushan Road case and the Research Institute case. You can find loopholes, but no one will directly go against the Federation's laws." Zhou Yu looked at him and said, "You can't find loopholes, but you can't leave any loopholes. The style of doing things in this circle will never be too violent or direct, and they definitely won't use an axe to smash things." Looking at Su Lu, who was deep in thought and had a hint of conflict between his straight eyebrows, Zhou Yu was silent for a moment before she said quietly, "I know what kind of person you are. You really don't belong here, but since you chose to come here, you have to do things according to the rules." She picked up a piece of bamboo leaf that was half green and half yellow from the flowing water beside her and quietly looked at the lines on the bamboo leaf. She didn't know if it was because she was thinking about her own life or something else, but her voice became a little lighter. Not to mention the capital, Harbor City, or other big cities in the Federation, there are many private clubs that are quieter and more luxurious than this place. However, those are all places for private gatherings. Only Lin Yuan is a place where one can express one's attitude. She placed the bamboo leaf on the table and said, "When the bamboo leaf falls on the ground, it will be swept away and sent to the landfill to be buried. If it falls into the water, it will drift with the waves for a while. Eventually, you will be able to see the scenery that we are seeing right now." Sulu turned his head and looked at the scenery outside the window through the glass. He opened his mouth and said, "It's a pity that there is no wind. It's not refreshing enough. The scenery here is not lively." He thought of the mines in the Donglin district. He and the uncle had eaten wild beef and held glasses of red wine. They had watched the red sunset in the dusky air and fall on the green grassland. That kind of enjoyment was much better than this Linyuan. "Sulu." A somewhat surprised and pleasantly surprised voice rang out. A young officer had passed through the bamboo forest and walked to the side of the table. Sulu was slightly startled. He didn't understand why Zhou Yu would suddenly appear here. Suddenly, he remembered that Zhou Yu was currently in the nutshell engineering department. His heart jumped, and he turned to look. Zhou Yu had her head tilted and was calmly drinking something. In an instant, he understood that this was not a coincidence. He couldn't help but sigh at Secretary Shen's quick and careful arrangements. Chapter 200. Although Linyuan was good, it was not something that Sulu could get used to. Even after entering Linyuan, he still could not get used to it. Those people who had come to greet him earlier had made it impossible for him to sit down. Now that he had suddenly met Zhou Yu, although he knew that the other must have come with some sort of motive, for some reason, Sulu felt his mood become much more relaxed when he looked at this young officer who was not more than 2 years older than himself. The first time he had met Zhou Yu was in the mecha combat room of Yue University's comprehensive gymnasium. The confrontation between the black mecha and the silver M37, the conversation amidst the smoke, these memories were all engraved in Su Li's mind. During that mecha combat, Zhou Yu's extremely graceful performance had left him with a very good impression. He vaguely felt that Zhou Yu already knew that he was the one inside that prototype mecha that had walked away with its belly full, but since the other had never directly asked, he did not admit anything either. Tai Ziyuan hid, Shi Qinghai hid, and Sulu fled. Other than the unmarried mother beside him, Sulu was a lonely mess in the capital ring. If it was said that lonely people were shameful, then Sulu was unquestionably so shameful that he was hated by both men and gods alike. He was a young man, so he naturally had the mental need to interact with others. In addition, he had always had a good impression of Zhou Yu, so after the recruitment exam at the beginning of spring, although the two of them had not seen each other again, they had still spoken on the phone a few times. Sulu moved away from the seat beside him and poured a full glass of wine for Zhou Yu. A mechanic was like a chief surgeon, what they needed the most was the stability of their hands. He was a very self-disciplined person, so he had rarely drunk alcohol these past few years. However, in the past 2 years, under the influence of Mr. Shi, other than the Sanchi brand cigarettes, he had also developed a hobby of drinking. Fortunately, although the color of the plum wine was thick, its actual alcohol content was not high. Zhou Yu sat beside Sulu and bowed his head slightly to Zhou Yu, who was sitting across the table. However, it was as if Zhou Yu did not see him. She looked coldly out the window at the white cliff in the distance. From the bottom of her heart, the young miss of the Zhou family was still that cold and arrogant eldest miss. Her gentleness in front of Lady Tai was trained. Her calmness in front of Sulu was forcefully ground out by the stones in Dong Linyuan. Today, she had brought Sulu into Linyuan to arrange a coincidental meeting between him and Zhou Yu. As for Zhou Yu herself, she had no interest at all. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he looked at the wine in his cup. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that Zhou Yu did not have any reaction. He only smiled warmly as he sat down and raised his cup. Just like his name, he was indeed as gentle as jade. It was just that jade also had a soul, it was just that he didn't have a chance to show it for the time being. I really didn't expect you to come, and so quickly. Sulu shook his head and drank all of the wine in his cup. Zhou Yu brought the red clay cup to his lips and raised his wrist slightly. The rim of the cup did not leave his lips. He appeared to be very gentle, but in reality, he quickly drank all of the wine in the cup. He placed the cup down at the same time as Su Li's hand. I also didn't expect you to cause so much trouble in just a few months after entering the research institute. Zhou Yu finished the wine in his cup and placed his military cap on the table beside him. He turned his body slightly and looked at Su Li calmly. You should understand why I'm here. At this moment, there were 3 people by the bamboo table beside the flowing water. Zhou Yu was a girl that Lady Tai had taught single-handedly. In addition to her family, Su Li did not need to avoid her when talking with Zhou Yu. Su Li's fingers gently gripped the wine cup as he sank into deep thought. When he saw Zhou Yu arrive, he knew what Secretary Shen planned to do next. He didn't need to know what kind of agreement Secretary Shen, the Li family, and the Federal Academy of Science had reached in order to smoothly get him out of prison. He only knew that he could no longer stay in the Husk Institute. If he wanted to turn the data in his brain into a real new generation of mecha, it would require the hard work of many people. Under the pressure of the other party, Su Li was about to be transferred out of the Nutshell headquarters and sent to the Baigong Security Company under the Shell Motor Company. His data would be sent to the Shell Motor Corporation Engineering Department, and this required a channel. Although the Li family and the Federal Academy of Science no longer cared about him, the other party would definitely keep an eye on Su Li. If Su Li was directly sent to the Nutshell Engineering Department, it would definitely arouse the suspicions of those people. In order to compete with the Federal Academy of Science for time, this sort of suspicion had to be eliminated. Coincidentally, the personal relationship between Su Li and Zhou Yu that could be confirmed became a natural disguise. Let's keep in touch in the future. Su Li raised his wine cup and looked at Zhou Yu sincerely. Although it wasn't until tonight that he found out that Zhou Yu was also someone that the Tai family could influence, he couldn't help but be shocked by the Tai family's control over human affairs. However, his intuition told him that Zhou Yu was someone worth interacting with, so his attitude was very sincere. Zhou Yu downed the wine in his cup once more and said with a smile, "Last time, when I sparred with you at Yue University, I thought that your talent in mecha operation was astonishing. But I really didn't expect that you would actually be able to influence the development of new mecha for the Federation. You have brought me too many surprises, so please don't worry, I will cooperate with you very well." Being directly reminded of the past by Zhou Yu, thinking back to the battle between the 2 mecha at Yue University, Su Li looked into Zhou Yu's eyes and couldn't help but laugh self-deprecatingly. There was no such thing as mutual admiration between heroes, the 2 of them had just found that they were somewhat compatible. I'm currently in the engineering department's office. Anda has been specially recruited to be a mecha test pilot. Zhou Yu put down his wine cup and turned to look at Su Li. After a long silence, he said, "In the end, it's still you from Donglin who's developed the fastest." Su Li didn't say anything, pouring him another cup of wine. At the same time, he filled his own red clay wine cup and raised it. The bamboo leaves of the bamboo house fell into the meandering stream. The 3 of them drank in silence by the window. Zhou Yu observed Su Li but found that he couldn't quite understand this person. He was born in the West Woods region, which was at the forefront of the battle between the Federation and the Empire. The people of the West Woods were mostly bathed in blood and fire. Their temperaments were valiant and ruthless, and they had a spirit that would rather break than bend. Although Zhou Yu's expression was gentle and amiable like a gentleman, deep in his heart, there was still a trace of unwillingness to fall behind others. Tonight, when he saw Su Li and Lin Yuan, Zhou Yu knew that even if he didn't want to, he had to. Perhaps it was luck. This person from Donglin had first met Tai Ziyuan, then met Professor Shen. He had grasped the Federation's most important and confidential data, and had even received the strong support of the Tai family. Just based on these points alone, he had already left Zhou Yu in the dust. Zhou Yu drank his wine in silence. Before coming to Lin Yuan, he had already learned all the details of the entire incident from Secretary Shen. He understood that Su Li didn't rely on luck. Whether it was the gleaming blade at Hushan Road, the axe marks at the Research Institute, or the baiting or forcing of the Tai family in the end, there was no place that didn't reveal this young man's stubbornness. Stubbornness was an excellent or troublesome quality, but when it was taken to the extreme, it would become exceptionally terrifying. Just like at this moment, the scenery in Linyuan was beautiful. There was no music to annoy the ears, but there was running water that could calm the heart. The people eating and chatting, or rather, the people, wore simple but expensive clothes that fit their bodies. Their movements were elegant and quiet. Only Su Lu, who was beside him, wore a casual shirt of unknown brand that probably didn't cost much. It had a lot of wrinkles on it. He just sat like this in Li Yuan's most expensive bamboo house cubicle. He sat with one leg bent, the hand that was holding the wine glass on his knee, and his head slightly lowered. He looked very much like those unemployed people on the streets in movies. What Zhou Yu didn't know was that Su Lu was originally an orphan from a mining family in Donglin. In the past, before they met that uncle, what he and Li Wei were most used to doing was sitting with their legs crossed on the sidewalk of Zhonglo Street and watching the TV screen in the cafe. This was a posture of thinking, and Su Lu was indeed thinking. Since he was very young, he was used to thinking in silence. In his opinion, if people didn't think, they were no different from the bison that only knew how to lower its head and eat grass outside the electronic fence. He was thinking about Linyuan, the delicious food on the table, the scenery outside the window, and the future. He thought very clearly, so when he bent his leg and held the wine glass, he vaguely became that orphan on the streets of the past. No one had entered Wang Du's fuming apartment. The surveillance equipment installed around the building confirmed that it was safe. Zhou Yu's expected delivery date was at the end of July, and she had already moved back to the Shishan courtyard. Presumably, the faint knife marks on her face and her impossibly large belly could sever the last hope of the Minister of Defense's family. As for whether Lady Tai had spoken during the Zhou family's reconciliation, Su Lu wasn't sure. It was just that he wasn't used to the fact that there was suddenly one less person in the room, so he buried his head and slept. When he woke up, he began to take big bites of the ready-to-eat lunch box that had been automatically reheated. For 3 whole days, his life consisted of sleeping and eating. He only walked out of the apartment and returned to the Research Institute after he had replenished all the energy and mental energy that he had expended. Many of the Husk Institute staff had seen Su Lu smash the laboratory into pieces with their own eyes. There were also some people with backgrounds who knew that he was involved in the death of an active duty officer in the Ministry of Engineering. When they saw him walk into the Research Institute like nothing had happened, their eyes suddenly became extremely shocked. The director of the 3rd Department of the Research Institute personally wrote an electronic recommendation letter for Su Lu. He was sure that he hadn't done anything wrong in the past few days. The young second lieutenant in front of him really did have a close relationship with Deputy Minister Zhou. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to stay in the Shell Motor Company after causing such a big mess. After Su Lu received the recommendation letter, he refused the enthusiastic director's request to personally deliver it to the Whitewater Security Company. He drove himself to the address on the letter. The black car once again drove past Hawking Avenue, where the Ministry of Finance was located. It drove past the dead end that led to the Bureau of Proclamation. The corners of his eyes twitched slightly, and he forced himself not to think about the omnipotent charter computer at the end of the road. At this moment, the phone rang. The sound of the 7th young master of the Li family, Li Xiaodong's extremely hearty laughter could be heard. I heard that you have been assigned to the Whitewater Company. Su Lu was slightly surprised. He didn't expect that after the night at the Ivy Garden, this person would actually take the initiative to contact him. He believed that he didn't have anything that the other party needed. Both the Li family and the Federal Academy of Science had already confirmed that the core data was in their hands. Yes, I'll report right now, Su Lu replied. The other end of the phone was silent for a moment. Then the voice said, "Can you do me the honor of coming out for dinner tonight?" Su Lu subconsciously looked at the weather outside the window. He confirmed that the sun's orbit today was normal. Perhaps the silence made Li Xiaotong a little uncomfortable. He said very seriously, I don't mean anything else. I just want to hang out with you. Chapter 201. White clouds floated on the mountainside in the distance. The dark green fields stretched as far as the eye could see. The precision irrigation equipment of the Federation's automated farm was spraying morning dew under the sun. From time to time, a faint buzzing sound could be heard. It was in perfect harmony with the chirping of the insects in the forest beside the road. The capital special district's traffic was very developed. After driving for 40 minutes along the highway, the solemn buildings of the capital were no longer in sight. The smell of power was also gone. As far as the eye could see, there was only verdant greenery and the wonderful smell of juice from the broken stems. Just beside the Federation's automated farm, high walls and iron fences separated a large area. From the road, one could only see a 5-story building in the courtyard. Other than that, there were no other eye-catching buildings. The window of the black car rolled down. Sulu showed the electronic recommendation letter to the guard. With a beep, the door slowly opened. He narrowed his eyes and looked at everything around the car. He was a little surprised. The Federation's largest security company, Whitewater Security Company, was located in the capital special district. It looked quiet with a sense of decline. It didn't look like a company famous for the Federation's high-end weapons. Instead, it looked like a forgotten farm amusement park. Where there was metal, there would be fruit shells. The Shell Motor Company was a giant company in the Federation. The number of people who directly or indirectly served it exceeded 1 million. This company had countless branches, and its business scope involved all aspects of the Federation's social life. Whitewater Security Company was one of them. Because of the disturbance in the research institute, Sulu was sent to Whitewater Security Company. Before he came, he did some research and found out that this was the Federation's largest security company. Although the Shell Motor Company didn't pay much attention to them, in terms of strength, they were the strongest among the Federation's 3 largest security companies. The Federation had a lot of military operations in the universe. Because of the diplomatic pressure from the Empire and the 100 Mu Triangle, it was inconvenient to mobilize the military. Plus, there were some conflicts with firepower on resource planets, or some secret operations that could not see the light of day. Most of the time, it was the 3 major security companies of the Federation that carried out these operations in place of the federal military. And Whitewater, which was directly under the Shell Motor Company, because of the thick federal military color of its shell, became the main operator. Of course, these were all things that couldn't be seen in the news, but those who knew the inside story knew very well that the Whitewater Security Company was actually a group of mercenaries disguised as mercenaries, or rather, the Federation's thugs disguised as mercenaries. In addition to some security work within the Federation, most of the company's business scope was actually in the borderlands of the Federation. There was even a rumor that after the firefight between District S2 and the anti-government forces had stopped, the company was also secretly involved in the small armed forces that carried out the surprise attack. Therefore, Sulu was a little surprised when he saw the base that looked like a simple factory. From the outside, the headquarters of the Whitewater Security Company didn't have a trace of military color. After the personnel department reported in, an affairs officer wearing glasses coldly led Sulu to an office at the back of the building and said to him, "This is your office. In a moment, your secretary will come over to give you the details of your work." What happened in the Capital Special District didn't spread to the Whitewater Security Company, so the people in the headquarters didn't care at all about the arrival of a young second lieutenant. The affairs officer in the personnel department didn't think that Sulu had any background. In his opinion, being sent to the Whitewater Security Company from the Husk Institute meant that he was definitely a loser in the struggle, and a complete failure. However, the Shell Motor Company's first-order department after all, while the Whitewater Security Company was only a third-order department. Sulu had such a resume, so even though he was banished here, he was still assigned the position of technical supervisor and even a secretary. The affairs officer looked at Sulu expressionlessly and asked, "Is there anything else?" The combat personnel of the Whitewater Company were extremely outstanding, and the base was also very well equipped. Many of the combat personnel were even military personnel themselves. These combat personnel on the front lines were well paid and had a promising future. However, the affairs officers and technical supervisors were all pitiful people who were pushed out of the core area of the Shell Motor Company. The affairs officer was the same, but he didn't have the slightest bit of sympathy for Sulu, who was also a loser. "No, thank you," Sulu said, turning on the computer screen. Sulu squinted his eyes and looked at the organization structure of the Whitewater Company. For a moment, he fell into silence. The Whitewater Company was established 24 constitutional years ago. The current CEO, Garay, was once the commander of the Federation's Special Mecha Forces before he retired. According to rumors, after his term at the Whitewater Company ended, he might directly return to the Ministry of Defense to be the commander of the Operations Department. The structure of this company was very strange. Important people like the CEO and the head of training, as well as the basic combat personnel, all had extremely bright futures. However, people like Su Li's current role, technical supervisors and affairs officers, seemed to be forever stuck in the shadow of the Federation. They carried out those dark missions for the righteous Federation government, but they didn't receive any military medals or rewards. However, this had nothing to do with Sulu. He was assigned to the Whitewater Company because of the consequences of his actions in the experiment. In order to appease the displeasure of the board of directors and the unrest in the research institute, even the Tai family could only do this much. Sulu never thought that he would go to a border resource planet to suppress the natives on behalf of the government, nor did he think about disguising himself as a militant and going to District S2 to destroy the anti-government military's resource base. He only needed to sit down in the technical supervisor position of this department, repair some mechanical equipment required by combat personnel, and live out this period of time peacefully. Until the Federation's new generation of MX-type mecha was successfully developed, it looked like he would have to spend his life in this company. Thinking of this, Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked around his office. This was the first time in his life that he had an independent office that would not be disturbed by others. The problem was that although this office was very luxurious, other than a computer and some furniture, there was nothing else. The company has 5 subsidiaries under its jurisdiction: the training center, the shooting range, the weapons experiment department, the space guard, and the security consultant. Clients include the Ministry of Defense, the Police General Administration, and the HTD Bureau. We also accept requests from outside the star system, as long as these requests do not violate the Federation's laws. Our 7th team's main business is in the security consultant area. Sulu lowered his head and listened to the secretary's report. To be honest, when he first heard that there was a secretary, a strange feeling arose in the young man's heart. He secretly prayed that the company would not give him a middle-aged woman with a lifeless aura. When this secretary named by Yulan walked into the office and began to introduce the Whitewater Company's situation according to the script, Sulu could not help but sigh softly. The name, female secretary, was a bit vulgar, but the wonderful thing was that this secretary was not a middle-aged woman, nor was she a young and attractive girl who had just graduated. Because the person who came in was not a female secretary at all, the secretary, by Yulan, was 1.73 meters tall. His facial features were gentle and soft, and his eyes were calm. He stood quietly in front of Sulu like a girl, but the problem was that he was not a woman, so this kind of aura was a bit strange. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at him. From this strange aura, he caught a hint of danger. Su Li's ability to recognize people was very strong. He had the keen intuition of an animal. If it were not for the fact that Secretary Bai stood in front of him like a serene young girl and did not show any hostility, perhaps he would have felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Only people who had killed many people and did not take human life seriously would show this kind of aura. In the past years, Sulu had seen many powerful people, such as Captain Tian, Madman Li, and Brother Zheng, who was beside the 7th young master of the Li family. The secretary in front of him, Bai Yulan, was different from these people. He restrained himself very well, but he always gave people the feeling that he would go crazy in the next moment. The calm and gentle expression on his face would turn into a bone-chilling coldness in an instant. When Su Lu was looking at Secretary Bai's eyes were looking at the booklet in his hand. His heart was calm, so his appearance was calm. Although he did not welcome a young second lieutenant sent by the Research Institute to be the technical supervisor of his group, he did not show the slightest expression. He just calmly and indifferently did what he was supposed to do. After being in the military for many years, Bai Yulan was used to seeing death and blood. He did not see this young and ordinary guy in front of him. What is the work of our group? Su Lu noticed that Secretary Bai's hands were as white as jade and very delicate. Reporting to the technical supervisor, Team 7 does not have any work arrangements this year, Secretary Bai replied politely. Su Lu was not used to the title of technical supervisor. Whitewater Company was a subsidiary of the Shell Motor Company. In addition to carrying out those dangerous missions, the most important work was to cooperate with the Federation to experiment with new weapons and equipment. Therefore, within Whitewater Company, the technical supervisor had more power than other security companies. Su Lu was the technical supervisor of Team 7, which was why this delicate Bai Yulan was his secretary. Since Team 7's main work was in the field of security consulting, they definitely would not be stationed on a border planet. However, they also did not have the opportunity to come into contact with those few failed MX prototype mecha. A faint feeling of disappointment grew in his heart. Half of year 67 of the constitutional calendar had passed, and Team 7 of Whitewater Company's Security Consulting Department still had not carried out any missions. Su Lu felt that it was a little strange. Although the Federation had always maintained good law and order, the rich and powerful had always attached great importance to their own security. With Whitewater Company's reputation in the industry, it should not have been possible for Team 7 to not have any business for an entire year. He looked at Bai Yulan's delicate hands and was somewhat lost in thought. Chapter 202. There were many apartment buildings on the 13th Avenue of the Capital Special District. Outside the gate of the high-end apartments, which were shrouded in orange lights, taxis stopped and left. Ladies holding flowers walked in and out of the apartments with lonely expressions. Along the streets, middle-aged men could be seen hurriedly walking with newspapers rolled up in their hands, and old women could be seen staggering as they were led by several big dogs. Wild cats, attracted by the smell of hot vegetable oil bread, were crouching under the iron railings next to the apartments, looking pitifully at each other. This was a city full of the smell of power. The rental of the apartments on the 13th Avenue was extremely high. Most of the residents were government workers in the Federation, or executives of large companies. Only these people would not care about the large amount of tax they had to pay to the HTD Bureau every year to raise pets. In recent years, the high-class prostitutes of the Federation had also begun to move into the 13th Avenue. They knew that the security and environment here, as well as the big shots living here, could provide them with a steady stream of customers. Su Lu walked up from the underground parking lot at the end of the street. Feeling that the weather was a little hot, he took off his jacket and wrapped it around his arm. Although he still retained his military position as a civilian second lieutenant, he was already in the Whitewater Company, so he did not need to wear a military uniform every day. He silently walked past the high-class apartment buildings that towered into the clouds. Suddenly, he laughed. He thought of last year outside the nightclub in Linhai, Shi Qinghai mocked Zhou for using perfume that only high-class prostitutes of the 13 Great Paths would use. He didn't expect that the days would not pass quickly. The man and woman, who seemed to be irreconcilable, would have a child because of one night of madness. Looking at the number plate of the high-class apartment building, Su Lu confirmed that it was number 187. He walked in, gave the security guard a temporary pass number, and was politely led to the elevator door by the gray-haired butler. The elevator door opened, and a waiter led Su Lu to the corridor on the right. The more they walked, the more silent Su Lu became. He realized that the top 3 floors of the high-class apartment building had been completely opened up. The side of the corridor was quiet, and the dome above his head was made of transparent tempered glass. He did not know how much such a renovation would have cost. At the end of the corridor was a small room. The green wallpaper filled the entire space, and there was an oil painting on the wall. It was a dazzling golden sunflower. Opposite the oil painting was a glass window, and the window sill was densely packed with green plants. The flowers between the plants were blooming. All that entered his eyes were flowers, and at a glance, there were flowers everywhere. However, these bright and colorful flowers did not make it difficult for people to feel annoyed. Instead, they only felt that the colors were bright, and it made people feel refreshed. Just like in the bedroom in the ivy garden, Li Xiaotong was always surrounded by flowers. It seemed that only in this way could the 7th young master of the Li family convince himself that he was just a playboy. The first thing Su Le saw was not Li Xiaotong, who stood like a plum blossom, but the silent middle-aged bodyguard behind Li Xiaotong, Brother Zheng. Brother Zheng was standing behind Li Xiaotong's chair with his hands behind his back. He looked like a gun tightly bound with countless layers of coarse cloth. The cold light was restrained, and the murderous intent was not released. Li Xiaotong saw Su Le come in, smiled, stood up, and reached out his hand. "I am very surprised that you can come, but I am also very happy." Su Le clumsily reached out and shook hands with him. He had seen a lot of big shots and visited a lot of high-class places over the years. His heart had been shocked by the picturesque landscape of Macho's back mountain, so he shouldn't have been shocked by Li Xiaotong's 3-story building. However, he was still a nobody in his bones. Besides, coming here today was the first time that he was talking to the big shots of the Federation as an equal. Therefore, he was not used to it. During the night visit to the Ivy Garden, Su Le did not cut off Li Xiaotong's head with the knife in his hand. On one hand, he knew that Park Ji-ho was not sent by the 7th young master of the Li family. On the other hand, the silent brother Zheng was too strong. After that night's conversation, Li Xiaotong helped him hide the news of Park Ji-ho's death for a while. Although he did not do much, he still helped Su Le. This morning, on the road in the suburbs, Su Le received a call from this person. He had been thinking for a whole day before he decided to come to the banquet. But he did not understand why the other party wanted to meet him. Logically speaking, everyone thought that he had lost the fight for the laboratory data, so he should not have any value that could be used. Su Le believed in the Tai family's confidentiality. Even the young master of the Li family could not know that he still had the key data. As for what Li Xiaotong said on the phone about following him, Su Le could not even laugh. The richest family in the 7 families of the Federation was the Li family. According to Zhou Yu, although Li Xiaotong was ranked 7th in this generation, he was actually the second-in-line successor. Why would such a person follow him? This was too ridiculous to be a joke. In fact, after Su Le walked into the room, the 7th young master of the Li family seemed to have forgotten what he said on the phone. He just gently chatted with him and introduced the oil painting of flowers and trees in the room. Lin Banshan once said that the old men in the Federation are already rotten. They like to do things in the company of tea, in the heat of hot springs, and ponder with each other for 10 or 20 years before revealing their true thoughts. The dishes were already on the table. The aroma was not very strong, but the taste seemed to be very good. Maybe they did not want the aroma of the dishes to mix with the fragrance of the flowers in the room. These young masters were always so picky when it came to details. Su Le drank a mouthful of water and listened to Li Xiaotong with narrowed eyes. He had heard the name Lin Banshan many times. He only knew that this person was different from the rest of the Lin family. The Lin Yuan that Su Le had been to twice was his property. What made him feel a little strange was that when Li Xiaotong and Zhou Yu mentioned Lin Banshan's name, they would show a certain degree of respect and a little strange emotion. My eldest brother has no one in his eyes, only Lin Banshan. Li Xiaotong cut the vegetables on his plate. He lowered his head slightly, but the sincere smile on his face did not make the trace of malice disappear completely. He even looked down on your friend, the young master of the Tai family. Although I have always thought that my eldest brother has a good appearance, I have to admit that he is vigilant and respectful towards Lin Banshan. I am the same. Su Lu knew what kind of person Lin Banshan was, but at least he did not need to know at this time. Lin Banshan said that when you open the door, you have to see the mountain. When you see the mountain, you are the mountain. You can stand still and let wind blow from all directions. Li Xiaotong put down his knife and fork, looked at Su Lu across the table and said, so I will get straight to the point. I don't care what problems there are between the family, you, and the lady behind you. I want to establish some kind of personal friendship with you. This is why I asked you to come here today. That night in the Ivy Garden, Li Xiaotong had expressed a similar intention to Su Lu, but there was no time to say it more thoroughly. Hearing this, Su Lu was startled. He looked down at the ordinary jacket on the chair beside him and could not understand the other's meaning. That night, Li Xiaotong had asked Su Lu to introduce him to Tai Ziyuan at a suitable time, but Su Lu believed that just this little bit of benefit was not enough for the other to formally meet him. I think you should know that the data from the laboratory has already reached the Federal Academy of Science. Even if you want to ruin the plans of the young master of the Li family, I am of no use. Su Lu replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. Until today, he felt like he was on the terrace of Macho's back mountain. He was really not used to this kind of atmosphere. Since the other party was willing to get straight to the point, he had no reason to hesitate. If it was said that Great Secretary Shen was willing to work with Su Lu because of his relationship with Tai Ziyuan, and because he knew very well that Su Lu held in his hands mecha data that could affect the presidential election, then what about Li Xiaotong? Su Lu did not think that a small character like himself had any right to win the other's personal friendship. This is indeed a very regrettable matter. That elder brother of mine was persuaded by that old fox, Senator Macklin, and burrowed headlong into the presidential election. He thinks that this is a very delicious cake, but in my opinion, he is not doing his job properly. Li Xiaotong smiled, but the sinister look between his brows was still thick. But that night, I told you that I don't care at all about the presidential election. No matter how the president of the Federation changes, the 7 major families are still the same 7 major families. This is something that history has long since proven. But I am still the type of person that your family doesn't like, said Su Lu. As long as I like it. Li Xiaotong sipped the champagne in his glass and said slowly, our Li family has always been doing business. That elder brother of mine has been doing well these past few years, and the old men in the family all like him very much. They actually allowed him to cross the line, but they don't know that the deeper you cross the line, the greater the risk. I don't want to do that. Doing business is for the sake of making money, why bother with those things? Su Lu felt that Li Xiaotong was about to get to the point. I am not Li Shuzhu. I am a businessman, and I only do what a businessman should do. Li Xiaotong stared into his eyes and said, I want to invest in you. I don't know what potential value I have that is worth the investment of the 7th young master of the Li family. You underestimate yourself. Li Xiaotong looked at him quietly and said, without data, you still have this person who can easily break through the defense of the Ivy Garden and the 3 layers of scanning of the Research Institute. I can't let such an unfathomable guy go so easily. Of course, I definitely won't invest in you as an assassin. Brother Zeng still stood calmly and silently behind Li Xiaotong. Just from this, Su Lu knew that Li Xiaotong was not an ordinary person. The powerful bodyguard that the family had sent to his side was unexpectedly not guarded against. This showed that this person's ability was extraordinary. Perhaps this is a gamble, but I'm willing to take it. Li Xiaotong continued, I think even Lady Tai is willing to meet him in person. If I bet on him, even if I lose, I won't lose too much. Su Lu was slightly startled. He didn't expect that what gave Li Xiaotong confidence was the meeting at the back mountain of Macho the day before. With an elder leading the way, if I don't know how to follow him to get a bowl of soup to eat, then I don't deserve to be a businessman. Of course there is a risk in investing, but it is precisely this kind of risk that brings benefits. You don't know that Lady Tai rarely sees people, but I am willing to bet on you not only because of this, but also because of what you have shown in this matter. Li Xiaotong suddenly laughed. The Federation is a place with rules. Whether it is the old men in my family, the lady of the Tai family, or even Commander Zhong in the West Woods, they all have to follow certain rules to do things, but you are different. Li Xiaotong narrowed his eyes and stared at his face with great seriousness. He said, there is something about you that doesn't stick to one pattern. Those unreasonable axes of yours actually made my elder brother and those hypocrites at the Academy of Science look so pathetic. In this world where rules must be followed, you don't follow the rules. This is why you are destined to either die an extremely miserable death in the future, or you will fight for a completely different future. The last person in this circle who didn't follow the rules like this was Lin Banshan. No matter how arrogant that little madman of the Li family is, there is still the old man who can firmly suppress him. Other than Lin Banshan and you, I can't see anyone else in this circle who can't find something above their heads that can suppress you. I also have to follow the rules, so even though I know that Park Ji-ho jumped into the arms of my big brother, I can't do anything about it. He also saw this point, so he was so presumptuous. Speaking of which, I have to thank you for helping me kill him. Li Xiaodong's tone became indifferent. But the problem now is that if I also follow the rules, this family will never be mine, so I have to invest in a person who doesn't follow the rules at all. A few days ago, I didn't make up my mind. Li Xiaodong's cold and stubborn face, like a plum blossom, showed a trace of a sad expression. But your unreasonable axes in the lab really hit my weak point. The lethality of this kind of resentful expression was really too great. If Shi Qinghai showed this kind of expression, it would probably be a bit tempting. If the beautiful young master of the Li family, Li Xiuzhu, showed this kind of expression, it would probably be a bit charming. Only Li Xiaotong was gloomy, surrounded by flowers, but he sighed faintly. It couldn't help but be like a pine tree that was pressed down by snow suddenly became delicate like a flower in a greenhouse, making people feel helpless. In Zhou Yu's words, Su Lu was an outsider who didn't even understand what was going on, so he was completely unreasonable and ignorant. In terms of mechanics, he was talented, in terms of recognizing people, and in terms of calmness, he was talented, but in the end, he was still a stubborn stone that had not been polished. He was stubborn, but he was slightly clumsy, and he didn't understand a lot of things. After staying silent at the table for a long time, Su Lu used the mind of an engineer to carefully arrange the things needed in his plan, and then he found that no matter whether what the young master of the Li family said was true or not, it seemed that he really didn't have anything that he couldn't lose in this federation. So he grinned and said seriously, I need a lot of money. In the suburbs of the southwest corner of the capital special district, several highways converged here, and then extended to the various states of the Federation planet S1. It was 9 o'clock at night, and the highways were brightly lit, but there were not many cars driving. On the contrary, behind a mountain next to the highway, there was a road without street lights on both sides, but it was very lively and noisy. Countless famous brand sports cars gathered here, and the modified headlights emitted dazzling light, illuminating the usually quiet and almost abandoned road. A motorcade of 4 cars got off the highway out of the city and went around the hill. The scene of horns on both sides of the road became much quieter because of the arrival of the motorcade. Countless pairs of eyes looked over, and many people recognized the blue Silver Wraith. The Silver Wraith was the most expensive sports car in the Federation, but this Silver Wraith was not silver, and it was even more famous on the side of the hill road. Not everyone knew that this Silver Wraith belonged to the second heir of the Li family, but everyone knew that the owner of this car had a cold temperament, and was an extremely big shot that was not to be trifled with. Their attention was attracted by the Silver Wraith, and not many people noticed the unmarked, ordinary-looking black car in the convoy. The motorcade drove to the end of the mountain road, and then it slowly came to a stop on the extremely quiet high ground. Li Xiaotong and Su Lu got out of their cars and looked at the lively scene on the road not far from their feet. Their bodyguard, Brother Zeng, stood behind them indifferently. It was not appropriate to describe Su Lu and Li Xiaotong at this time as each of them had ulterior motives. Su Lu did not have the ability to scheme in front of these children of aristocratic families, and for a big shot like the seventh young master of the Li family to condescend to associate with Su Lu, he naturally had some ulterior motives, but the ulterior motive was still far away, not in the immediate interests. Since Li Xiaotong decided to establish a personal friendship with this young second lieutenant, they naturally needed to get along and see each other's temperament. A meal was far from enough, so he took Su Lu to the western suburbs of the capital, the paradise of the reckless racing gang. I know that your girlfriend has been dead for half a year. Li Xiaotong glanced at Su Lu next to him and said calmly, I have a lot of properties in the 13 great roads, and those high-class prostitutes have to give in to me. But you are not willing to accept, so I have to take you here to see. Su Lu was silent. He did not know if Li Xiaotong had any deep meaning when he mentioned Zhang Xiaoming's death. He had never forgotten the life and death separation hidden behind the political dark of the Federation. He had forcibly seized the data left by Professor Shen. At this time, he stood with the seventh young master of the Li family. On one hand, he wanted to fight for the honor that Professor Shen deserved, and on the other hand, he wanted to make arrangements for his own plan. What was strange was that although the Li family's seventh young master was so rich that he could kill people, he didn't have too many displeasing behaviors. Su Lu gradually understood the so-called aristocratic family's younger generation. The richer and more powerful they were, the more low-key they would be. However, what made him feel a little strange was that Li Xiaotong, who was gloomy and indifferent, was extremely careful with his tone of voice when talking to him. In this regard, Li Xiaotong was even better than Tai Ziyuan. He did not reveal a trace of a natural sense of superiority. This was something that should be hidden in the bones of the children of the aristocratic families, but Li Xiaotong was able to hide it so well. Su Lu thought silently. He was afraid that Li Xiuzhu, the true successor, would really have to be careful. Su Lu had been silent, but Li Xiaotong did not have any opinion. He pointed to the sports cars on the road and said with a smile, when I first met you at the entrance of Qingshan Park, I knew that you didn't like the way the rich people race cars. They don't care about human lives. But it's different here. This was originally the Shoujing Expressway. Later, a new road was built, and the old road was abandoned. There have always been very few cars and pedestrians passing by here. Moreover, the guys who race cars are all professionals, so they are very safe. I'm not interested in racing. Su Lu shook his head. Is that so? That day on the number 2 expressway, you chased me and Zhou Yu until we were in a bit of a mess. Li Xiaotong smiled and said, of course, you are now used to driving the Crown Prince's special car. Looking at these so-called brand-name sports cars, it's natural that you don't like them. Su Lu shook his head again. He noticed that there was a temporary makeshift house on the side of the road. There was a faint blue light from a computer screen in the makeshift house. After thinking for a while, he guessed what was going on there. He said with a hint of surprise, gambling is so professional. Don't underestimate the gambling here. 12 years ago, Lin Banshan started his business here. Li Xiaotong's expression calmed down. When he mentioned that person's name, he couldn't help but have a trace of fascination. He said slowly, back then, the Lin family was like our Li family now. Several of their children were very outstanding. In order to compete for the recognition of the previous generation, they were very busy. Lin Banshan was the youngest in their generation, but he was also the most promising one. He suddenly shook his head and exclaimed, as a result, on my 18th birthday, Lin Banshan sneered in front of all the guests and family elders in the courtyard and said, I'm too lazy to accept this kind of family business. After saying this, he ate a piece of cake, kowtowed to his parents 3 times, and left the Lin family without looking back. Hearing this story, Su Lu couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Lin Banshan was proud but not stupid. It was just that at that time, he was too rebellious in his bones. Seeing his brothers frowning every day, he felt disdain. He didn't want this family business, so he left in a carefree manner. He wanted to fight for his own country. After leaving the Lin family, Lin Banshan's first stop was here. At that time, the capital New Expressway had just opened. He opened a casino here, gambling on racing. In less than half a year, he made his first pot of gold. Then, he used the money to buy the hostel-like restaurant in HTD Bureau, which is now Linyuan. Linyuan? Sulu knew that Linyuan was Lin Banshan's business, but he didn't expect that many years ago, Lin Banshan, who had vaguely become a legend, could actually buy that piece of land with the income from illegal racing. So, don't underestimate the income here. Li Xiaotong said calmly, we are all children of aristocratic families, and we all know how rich the family business is. Lin Banshan said he didn't want it and left in a carefree and arrogant manner. I grew up with a golden spoon in my mouth, but I don't have his courage. I feel ashamed just thinking about it. The 7 families of the Federation were not ordinary families, and they were not ordinary businesses. Even if they failed to fight for the right of inheritance and stayed at home, they could enjoy a lifetime of wealth and privileges that the citizens of the Federation could not imagine. But Lin Banshan left at the age of 18, leaving behind words of disdain, and left in such an arrogant manner. This universe, this Federation, is made up of countless rules. The mysterious Lady Tai, the powerful president, and the noble army god still have to take care of the interests of all sides, constantly compromise and strive to find a balance between those lines. Li Xiaotong said indifferently, Lin Banshan broke the rules, and I think one day, maybe you can break it too. I'm not a member of this circle. For me, there are naturally no rules, Sulu replied. The modified sports car roared loudly. The car owners who were fussy about speed were naturally unwilling to use electric power or hybrid power, and the pungent smell of strong gasoline gradually filled the road. On the road at the foot of the mountain, a curvaceous girl was waving a flag, leading the car onto the track. From time to time, a wrecked car would be dragged back by a heavy-duty tractor. There were ambulances on standby at the bottom of the road. Everything seemed to be in order, but the cursing and whistling all around revealed the darkness and danger hidden in this place. Sulu calmly watched the scene unfold on the mountain. He did not pay attention to the winning or losing of these sports cars, but he was thinking about the person called Lin Banshan and the reason why the 7th young master of the Li family brought him here. According to Li Xiaotong, Lin Banshan had not returned to this hill for many years, and the casino here had long been transferred to someone else. But the rules set by this person 12 years ago were still there, and no one dared to make any changes, and no one dared to violate these rules. He had not returned for many years, but his influence was still so strong. It had to be said that the traitor of the Lin family was a very bad person. Do you want to play a little bet? Li Xiaotong looked at the silent Sulu, and felt more and more that his investment was very good. He had never seen a young man who could be so calm in a place like this where hormones were at their peak. If the Federation was full of people like Sulu, then no matter how arrogant Lin Banshan was, he would not have been able to make much money. If I had money, I would not ask you for money. Sulu said with a smile, but his eyes narrowed. He found that in the waiting sports car on the road below, there was a figure that he felt was familiar. Investment is one thing. The room we ate in today, just the decoration and the few broken paintings cost me more than 4 million. The money you want will naturally be transferred to your account tomorrow. It will be transferred to the account you set up for me, Sulu corrected. Li Xiaotong smiled slightly, and the hem of his black coat swayed slowly in the night wind. He said, in addition to investment, it is also okay for friends to exchange what they need. You are not in a convenient situation, so I can lend you some money to make a small bet. It is not a bad idea. I don't borrow money. If I borrow money and return it, I will owe you a favor. Like you said, this is not the same as investment. Damn you. Li Xiaotong did not know if it was because he was used to acting gloomy in front of his brother and family elders. Even if he was angry and laughing at this time, there was still a sense of gloominess. He laughed and scolded, "Can you take it as a gift? Why do I have to bet?" Su Lu looked at him curiously. Li Xiaotong calmly replied, "People who do business are very superstitious. I also pay attention to luck. If there is no accident, you are probably the riskiest and biggest investment I have made in my life. Tonight, I am here to try my luck and hope for a good start. If I lose the bet, you will continue to invest in me." Su Lu smiled and said, "Then what is the point of us betting on cars? What if I win?" At this time, a group of people near the hill suddenly became noisy. It seemed that they had made a big bet and were very confident, so those young masters were shouting something loudly. Just as Li Xiaotong said, there were rules everywhere in the Federation. Both sides of the road were crowded with excited people, but there were not many people on the hill. Only people with status could come here. It is the son of the deputy chairman. He does not know who I am, and we have not talked before. Li Xiaotong glanced over and said to Su Lu. The deputy chairman of the Federation Management Committee was undoubtedly one of the most powerful people. Even Li Xiaotong was not willing to provoke his idiotic son. Su Lu glanced over and immediately withdrew his gaze. "The white sports car down there is his. I heard that the driver is a professional driver specially invited from S3. The bonus one is not that much because the odds are so low. After all, this is an off-road race. No one dares to hope to win against a professional driver." Li Xiaotong pointed at the few cars on the road and said, "This kind of game is actually very unruly, but no one is willing to care about him, so they can only lower the odds. Look at the cars next to that one. They are not famous in the circle. Obviously, the owner is giving face to the deputy chairman's son and letting him have a good time. All these years, under the suppression of his dazzling elder brother, the seventh young master of the Li family had been pretending to be a ruthless playboy, playing with beautiful women on various planets of the Federation. He was very clear about these matters. Lend me $1 million. Su Lu narrowed his eyes, looked at the road, and suddenly said. Lend, not give. Giving is a favor. I will return it to you. Legends don't appear every day in this place. Gambling like yours will really make you lose a lot. Li Xiaotong did not care about $1 million. He simply followed Su Li's eyes and found that the man next to him was staring at a race car. No matter how it is modified, that race car will always lose, Li Xiaotong said. Even if Lin Banshan drove it himself 12 years ago, it would still lose. Gambling is bound to lose, just like when you invested in me. Su Lu looked at the inconspicuous race car and the man next to the car who looked like a delicate woman. He narrowed his eyes and said, the risk of $1 million is not as great as the risk of you betting on me. That makes sense. I always thought that you were too calm and silent. You are young, but you are old and rusty. It is rare for you to go crazy. Of course, I have to take a look. Li Xiaotong laughed and asked his men to place their bets. Su Lu looked at the delicate man next to the race car. His expression was calm, but he was thinking about something else. He was not a gambler. He was curious about the famous Lin Banshan, but he was not interested in betting on this kind of racing. He was only interested in the delicate man. After all, he would be spending time with the delicate man in the future. He wanted to know what kind of person he was. Not many people cared about this race. The odds were too different. The winner had been decided long ago. Very few people placed bets. Except for the chairman's son on the hill who threw in hundreds of thousands of dollars out of boredom, there were basically no bets. Suddenly, on the light screen outside the makeshift room, there was an additional $1 million, which immediately caused a commotion in the room. According to the current odds, if the race car won, the chairman's son would have to fork out $7 million. Such a big bet was rare, even when Lin Banshan was personally holding the line. The crowd on the other side of the hill cast strange glances at Li Xiaotong and Su Lu. There were not many people who could spend a lot of money to buy a quick profit. Only these two groups of people on the hill had the ability to do so. However, the people on the other side did not expect that their professional racer would lose. The deputy chairman's son even thought that this group of people deliberately lost a lot of money to him in order to make friends with him. More than 10 minutes later, everyone saw a very shocking scene. The race car, which seemed like it would fall apart at any time, slowly came back. Its speed was as slow as the broken carriage pulled by an old cow in ancient fairy tales. But the problem was that there was no other sports car behind the race car. Even the famous sports car driven by the professional racer was nowhere to be seen. Near the turning point in the distance of the old Shojing Expressway, flames could be vaguely seen. No one knew what happened, but the heavy trailer and ambulance rushed away. There was a dead silence on both sides of the road. It was not until the delicate man climbed out of the race car that there was a burst of ear-piercing screams and cheers. Li Xiaotong indifferently looked at the bustling scene on the road. He looked at the delicate driver and slowly turned his head to look at Su Lu. He said, "Looks like we found another guy who doesn't follow the rules tonight." He had layers of doubts in his heart. How did Su Lu know that the race car was a crazy guy who was not afraid of death, and was not afraid of killing people? The racer was so delicate, as gentle and calm as a virgin. There are many unreasonable things in the Federation, but there are also many coincidences. Su Lu looked at the delicate man who was walking up the hill. He lowered his head and said, "Maybe you don't believe it, but I just saw this person today. He is my secretary." How much money a racer could get all depended on how much he bet on himself. Only then could he get a bonus. The White Magnolia needed money, so he had come here tonight to gamble with his life. However, if he hadn't placed a bet of 1 million, even if he had risked his life, he would only be able to get $110,000 from the son of the chairman. So he went up the hill personally to thank the person who had given him a lot of money. This had nothing to do with courtesy. He only respected people who could give him money. So when Bai Yulan saw that the person who had helped him earn a lot of money was actually the young technical director he had met today, his expression became a little strange. But he did not say anything. He said thank you to Su Lu and left the hill. This kind of desperate driving method, not to hurt others, but to hurt oneself first. It hasn't happened for a long time. Li Xiaotong looked at the delicate figure on the hill and reminded Su Lu, this kind of unruly driving method is very easy to get into trouble. Do you want to send some people to take him home? Su Lu did not say anything. He just thought about the delicate hands holding the folder. It was these delicate hands that drove the Sito so crazily. It was these delicate hands that forced the professional racer into a dead end. A person with such a pair of hands would not die so easily. Li Xiaotong walked to the son of the chairman. Even if it was the son of the deputy speaker of the Federation, losing 7 million all of a sudden, his expression became extremely ugly or embarrassed. However, it was unknown what the seventh young master of the Li family said, but the speaker's son returned to his usual arrogance and nodded lightly. "I will transfer the money that this prodigal lost to you." Li Xiaotong walked back to Su Lu. Looking at the chaos at the foot of the hill, he said, "It seems that my investment will be very good." After that night, Su Li's life returned to a dull and boring state. He lived in the apartment in Wangdu every day, worked in the farm-like headquarters of the Whitewater Company in the commercial district, and occasionally talked to Zhou Yu on the phone or had a meal with Li Xiaotong. He looked at the faces of the small stars in the Federation in front of money and wealth. It was more or less the same as before, but there were some differences. He met with Zhou Yu a few times and passed a part of the data model to him. However, he kept the direct results of his and Professor Shin's research. Li Xiaotong's large sum of money had already been transferred to his account. Su Lu began to buy the equipment and components he needed through the black market like an ant moving house. Su Lu didn't know how the Federal Academy of Sciences project was progressing. He also didn't know what influence Secretary Shen had on the Nutshell Engineering Department. He didn't even know the details of the engineering department's research on the new generation of the Federation's mecha, but he asked the other party to give him data feedback. The resources that needed to be prepared were prepared. The total data that needed to be obtained was also in his hands. The only thing that needed to be done was the failed prototype MX in the Whitewater Company. His secretary, Bai Yulan, came to his office to report once a day and then couldn't find him again. This delicate man's attitude towards Su Lu didn't change at all because of the bet that night. He was still as gentle as ever, but he was still as cold as ever. Just like that, 10 days passed. Su Lu felt extremely tired. At this moment, he couldn't help but think of Shi Qinghai. He thought of the days when he and Mr. Shi worked together to fight against the Federation Investigation Bureau. The Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department were in a secret competition. However, even though he had the core data, he couldn't do anything about it. He didn't even completely trust the Tai family, let alone Li Xiaotong. Secretary Bai was also cold to him. He didn't have a single partner by his side. This kind of pressure was too great. Shi Qinghai smiled as he looked at the surveillance camera on the door. His hands were behind his back, holding the Taiping axe that he had picked up in the corridor earlier. Then he swung the axe down. He completely ignored the apartment's complete surveillance and alarm system and smashed the door open. The alarm didn't sound. Shi Qinghai kicked the person behind the door to the ground. After closing the door, he dragged the axe and walked towards the person on the ground. The temperature in the apartment was extremely low. In this late spring and early summer, the owner of the apartment was still wearing a fitted synthetic sweater. Shi Qinghai didn't say a word to the man whose eyes were flickering. He swung the axe down and chopped off the man's right hand. Blood spurted out, and the man screamed in pain. Shi Qinghai exhaled softly. His handsome face was full of satisfaction. He praised, "You made me so hard to find." Chapter 203. After all, the blood in a human body was not the same as the water stored in a fire engine. After gushing out from the severed wrist, the blood was depleted in an instant, dripping and soaking the synthetic blanket in front of the sofa. The blanket was full of blood, and its color became extremely dark and heavy. However, the smell of blood was not absorbed, and instead, it began to spread around the room. The middle-aged man in the synthetic sweater was called Wang Xian, a very ordinary name, and a very ordinary person. At this time, he had lost an arm, and his face was pale. However, after the scream, he stubbornly pursed his lips and did not say a word. He used his left hand to press down on the joint of his right arm. He did not want to die from excessive blood loss, and he also did not think that this beautiful man in front of him would kill him immediately. People who did this kind of work were always extremely careful. The way they died was usually through betrayal or being silenced by their superiors. It was very rare for an enemy to come directly to their door and cut off their arm in such a violent scene. Wang Xian raised his head and looked at the beautiful man in front of him with resentful eyes. He did not ask how the other party found his place, although this was his biggest curiosity. He only forced himself to be calm and said, "What do you want?" The simple surveillance system and alarm system outside the apartment did not have the slightest reaction when the other party broke in. It seemed that the other party had already cleaned the surroundings of the apartment in advance. Although Wang Xian was only an intelligence officer, his ability to protect himself was not bad. However, in front of the other party, he could not even block a single kick, and he could not avoid that tyrannical axe. Combining these two situations, he knew how terrifying the enemy was today. More importantly, he recognized the real identity of this beautiful man at a glance. He began to feel fear and despair, but the other party did not immediately kill him, and he smelled a trace of opportunity. Shi Qinghai took out a pack of 37 brand cigarettes from his pocket, lit one, and took a deep breath. He crouched beside the pool of blood and took a wallet from Wang Xian's body. Through the phone of Senator Macklin's secretary, Helen, he obtained some information, but the information was too vague and too jumbled. It took him a full 3 days to sort through the information before he found the person in front of him named Wang Xian. This person was nominally a staff member of the S2 Mountain Ring 4 States Peace Foundation, but the number of times he appeared in Helen's phone seemed to be a little too much. Starting from this point of suspicion, he began to secretly investigate Wang Xian, paying special attention to this person's movements before the 1st of January of the 67th year of the constitutional calendar. He graduated from the first military academy with the highest grades, and was one of the most successful anti-government army spies in the Federation. No matter how well Wang Xian's cover, he still found many problems. "You should know me." While rummaging through his wallet, Shi Qinghai said vaguely with a cigarette in his mouth, "So, you should know very well that I'm here for revenge. It'll be very difficult for you to survive. But before you die, I'd like to know one thing. How did Senator Macklin send the information to Yang Jingsong of the Department of Defense when he learned that the source of danger was going to Linhai State Stadium?" Some of the ashes flew down with the slight movement of his lips, landing on the dark and bloody carpet. He continued calmly, "I've been investigating for a long time, and Macklin did indeed talk to Yang Jingsong on the phone. But with Yang Jingsong's enmity towards the comrades in the mountains, he shouldn't believe it so easily. So there must be another group of people who vouched for him." Shi Qinghai smiled slightly, and a kind expression appeared on his delicate face. "Tell me who that group of people is. Also, I believe that you must have some evidence that can embarrass Senator Macklin. Please give it to me as well." The other party was a military officer. "I don't know who's behind him, but there was one time when I found out that it seemed to be a big shot in Parliament Mountain. At first, I thought it was someone from the 7 great families, but after some analysis, I don't think so." Wang Xian leaned on the sofa, his eyes staring blankly at the blood dripping from his wrist. Without any hesitation, he confessed according to Shi Qinghai's request. He used to be a member of the organization, so he was very clear about the severity of the organization's punishment for traitors. Although this beautiful man in front of him seemed to have left the organization and become a wandering ghost, since he was able to become the organization's most successful spy in the capital ring of the Federation, the other party must have more tricks up his sleeve. He knew that he couldn't survive those tricks, and there was no loss for him and Senator Macklin to betray their partner. Did the military officer have any special characteristics? A standard professional soldier in the Federation. He used a military encrypted phone. I tried to eavesdrop on him a few times, but I failed. I couldn't follow him either." Wang Xian panted. "What I want are the real characteristics." He was wearing a wig. His real hair should be maroon red. Maroon red hair was indeed rare in the Federation, but there were at least a few million people in the population of tens of billions. After a moment of silence, Shi Qinghai said, "Looks like you're quite meticulous. That's all for this clue. Next up is the second one. I need something that can make Senator Macklin uncomfortable." This was the 3rd time Shi Qinghai had mentioned the word comrade. A strange expression appeared on Wang Xian's pale face. He panted and said, "I only asked you to give me a quick death. You know very well that I can't fulfill this request of yours." Shi Qinghai threw the wallet on the floor and took out a photo. It was a photo of Wang Xian, his wife, and daughter. He put the photo in front of Wang Xian's eyes and didn't say a word. He just waited for the other party's answer. Wang Xian bit his lip and didn't say a word. He knew that the other party was using his family's life to threaten him, but he still didn't say anything. Shi Qinghai frowned and looked at the photo carefully. Suddenly, he tore open a corner of the photo with 2 nimble fingers. It turned out that the photo was actually double-layered. After tearing open the top layer, he could see another photo underneath. Wang Xian's originally extremely pale complexion became even uglier at this time. The photo underneath was also a family photo, but the woman and child in it were different from the first photo. As a special agent, you made a fatal mistake. People like us don't have the right to expect love and family, not to mention having such a cute child. Shi Qinghai threw the photo on the floor beside Wang Xian. He picked up the axe and gently placed it on the photo. The sharp edge of the axe just happened to rest on the neck of the cute little girl in the photo. Even if you have a family, you should be more careful. What's the use of double-layered photos when you can't carry them around? This kind of artistic aura can really kill people. Don't implicate the wife and child. Wang Xian stared at Shi Qinghai with resentment. Don't forget the rules of the organization. Since the massacre 30 years ago, the organization has strictly prohibited the use of such violent means. If you dare to do so, the disciplinary committee won't let you go. Even, he, will have to bear the pain and behead you. When you betrayed my teacher, did you think about the consequences? Shi Qinghai's expression was calm, but his voice was incomparably cold. I believe you didn't, so I won't think about the consequences. I don't belong to any organization. I'm just carrying out a very simple revenge. Wang Xian's expression was gloomy. He knew that he was going to die today, but he had to think about his daughter. He knew that the handsome man in front of him could be a terrifying killing machine when he turned cold. Half an hour later, Shi Qinghai tidied up everything in the apartment. He checked the recording pen and the transferred data on him one last time. He walked out of the room and closed the door that had been cut open by the axe. Next to the sofa behind the door, the already dead Wang Xian lay in a pool of blood with his eyes closed. Taking the subway to the old airport in the capital, Shi Qinghai silently walked to a stove in the corner while listening to the street music of street performers hitting empty cannon shells. The weather in the late spring had begun to become hot and dry. No one was willing to go near the stove. There were only some remnants of incense ashes used to worship the dead. It seemed that the Yulan festival had just passed away. Taking off his gloves and shoes, Shi Qinghai put them into the fire. He calmly looked at the suddenly rising flames, as if he saw his teacher's chubby, sometimes serious, sometimes cute face in the flames. Su Lu and Shi Qinghai had lost contact for a long time. He didn't know that Mr. Shi was getting closer to the truth of the matter step by step. He even had some evidence that Senator Macklin was involved in the assassination in Linhai State. The problem was that both of them were young people who walked the path of revenge alone. Even if they had evidence in their hands, they probably wouldn't know where to send it. The wife of the Tai family should have been the most angry person. However, in the context of the Great Reconciliation of the Federation, and the fact that Senator Macklin represented the collective will of the people in the 4 states around the mountains, the political figures in the Federation probably wouldn't want to take such a risk when the election was about to begin. The computer screen showed the number in the account. Seeing so much money under his control for the first time, even someone as calm as Su Lu couldn't help but feel a little lost for a moment. Until today, he still didn't fully understand why the 7th young master of the Li family was willing to invest in him. An eclectic axe? This statement was too idealistic and too artistic. It shouldn't be the temperament of a calm businessman. Secretary Bai Yulan walked in and took the Weapons Maintenance Fund application documents that required Su Li's signature. He walked out of the room. These days, this delicate man still kept a distance from Su Lu. Half a minute later, Bai Yulan suddenly returned to the office. He looked at Su Lu for a long time and said, "There are some problems in the armory. Do you want to go take a look after work?" Chapter 204. Su Lu was silent, but that didn't mean he was dull. Su Lu was always smiling, but that didn't mean he was heartless. The environment he grew up in and his education background made it impossible for him to fully understand some methods of using people. Even if he understood, it might be difficult for him to do it with his temperament. So, since escaping from the Eastwood region, he had not had a single partner or helper except for a few friends who shared the same bad habits but ended up with bad endings because of this stubborn stench. Of course, it was a bit harsh to ask an orphan who had just turned 20 years old to suddenly become a powerful child of power. However, as an orphan who had been living in Bell Tower Street for several years, Su Lu was able to safely pass his adolescence. Apart from Uncle Feng Yu's care, Su Li's ability to observe people's expressions wasn't bad. In the words of that uncle, this kid seemed to have a natural ability to discern people's hearts. Su Lu was able to figure out what the people around him wanted in a very short time. For example, Li Wei wanted respect, so he wanted power and fists. For example, Zhang Xiaomeng wanted to follow in the footsteps of that old bastard, St. George. She wanted to take advantage of her youth and childishness to do the right thing, then turn into a sky full of fireworks, regardless of other people's tears. For example, Shi Qinghai wanted peace, but because of that director's leap, it became a bubble. Secretary Bai Yulan needed money. Although he didn't know where his urgent desire for money came from that night's car race on the old road of Shoujing Expressway, it could be seen that this delicate man was willing to give up his life for money. His behavior after the event also proved that this person respected money very much. The organizational structure of the Whitewater Company was somewhat similar to the military structure, but there were also some very different aspects. The most different aspect was reflected in the power of the technical director. The company's combat personnel undertook the task of testing new weapons for the federal military, guarding engineering spaceships on peripheral planets, or carrying out some dark missions for the Federation government. The performance of the new weapons in these battles indirectly determined the time series when the new weapons officially entered the Federal Army's standard equipment. The technical supervisor assigned to the combat team also had more power because of this background. After all, the experimental data of the new weapon and the tracking monitoring needed to be controlled by these technical supervisors. The technicians who were sent to the Whitewater Company from the Research Institute or the Engineering Department were undoubtedly sent away, but they had extremely high authority in their respective teams, just like Su Lu. Team 7, which Su Lu belonged to, was a little different from the other combat teams. This was because they were now part of the Security Consultant Department. This department was the most peripheral and least valued department in Whitewater Security Company. It was specifically responsible for the comprehensive planning of the personal safety of some of the influential figures in the Federation. In short, it was bodyguards. The first time he met Secretary Bai, Su Lu knew that the other party was not an ordinary person. The race that night had strengthened his confidence. Therefore, he did not understand why Team 7, which had a person like Bai Yulan, was not valued by the company. She was assigned to the Security Consulting Department and did not receive any business for half a year. Most importantly, Team 7 did not have a combat team leader. The highest-ranking officer was Su Lu, the technical director. This kind of personnel structure was strange. The dark armory was full of the smell of engine oil. The gradually setting sun could not shine into this forgotten corner. A week after entering the headquarters of the Whitewater Company, Su Lu found out that the underground of the headquarters, which looked like a farm, was actually a very large comprehensive base. The armory and the training ground were all underground. I used to be the leader of Team 7, but I committed a crime and was dismissed. However, the higher-ups also know that the guys in this team are not very obedient. It is useless to send a new leader. Bai Yulan was leaning against a scrapped self-propelled vehicle. Her delicate hands were in her purse, and there was a hint of coldness between her delicate eyebrows. However, the smell of engine oil in the armory and the scattered weapons and equipment made her look different from her usual self. She was like a decadent artistic youth who suddenly stood beside an oil brush. She no longer looked like a lady, but started to look like a real soldier. She was like a decadent artistic youth who suddenly stood beside an oil brush. This was Team 7's exclusive armory. The weapons and equipment inside looked to be in good condition, but they had not been maintained for a long time. No one knew how long they could last on the battlefield. Su Lu lay on the skateboard and looked at the internal structure of the self-propelled missile through his goggles. He was sure that if this weapon was transported to a mineral star to fight, it would only need to fire 2 shots before it would fall apart. Bai Yulan's gaze was a little cold, and there was a trace of loneliness hidden in that coldness. She looked at the 2 legs that extended out from under the self-propelled gun and her heart trembled slightly. She thought to herself that if this gun were to collapse at this moment, the person below would probably die more thoroughly. I don't know who you offended and who sent you to Team 7, but since you are here, I am afraid you will not be able to get out. Su Lu was still under the self-propelled missile. She did not know what he was busy with, but she did not answer. Bai Yulan did not seem to care. She was just calmly narrating some things. She had never known the background of this young technical director, who did not seem to be anything out of the ordinary. However, when she saw him standing on the hill during the race that night, she began to be vigilant. Especially after seeing the check of 1.2 million today, although Bai Yulan wasn't very curious about Su Lu, her attitude towards him had changed a lot. I'll just treat it as telling a story. Because of the smell of the check, he thought in his heart and waited for the other party's real request. The skateboard rattled as Su Lu finally crawled out from under the self-propelled gun. Looking at the equipment around the armory, he couldn't help but shake his head and ask, "Is this the armory for our team? Do we have to carry equipment every time we go out on a mission?" Hearing the words, "our team," Bai Yulan's eyebrows trembled. Her hands were still in her pockets, but they gradually clenched. For her, Team 7 would always belong to her and her brothers. No one should even think about getting a share of it. Every combat team has its own armory. According to the information obtained by the technical director from the company, the armory is distributed in batches. Su Lu used detergent to wash the stains off his hands. He walked in front of her. After a moment of silence, he said, "The Security Consulting Department. How can they have so much firepower? The equipment here is enough to occupy a small mineral star." Bai Yulan lowered her head and looked at the tips of her smooth leather shoes. Her eyes were soft and gentle. She smiled and said, "Team 7 was originally the company's ace combat team. I used to be the captain." She was still gentle and delicate, with a cold smile. She was very much like a proud and calm girl. However, Su Lu felt a different emotion from Bai Yulan for the first time. It was probably the so-called pride of a soldier. Ace combat team. Su Lu understood why he felt a sense of vigilance when he saw her for the first time. The Whitewater Company's ace combat team had always been carrying out dark missions assigned by the government. They spent most of their time in bloody battles in various parts of the universe. Their combat experience was probably much richer than the federal military's special forces. It was even possible that they were a secret federal military special forces and were just training in the Whitewater Company. How could such a team have fallen to such a state? You just said something happened. What is it? Su Lu looked at Bai Yulan and asked. The information I just told you is a gift from me. From now on, one question for 100,000. Secretary Bai retracted one of her feet. She put her hands in her pockets and lightly kicked the ground with the tip of her foot. No problem. When we were carrying out a mission last year, our team took on a private job. Although the mission was successful in the end, the losses were too heavy. You took on a private job because you were short of money? Yes. Is 120,000 enough? It's close. Just a little more. What mission did you carry out last year? It involves Federation secrets. Since you yourself don't know, then I can't tell you. 500,000 for this question. I love money and need money, but I love the Federation's laws and this little life of mine even more, Sir Supervisor. Was it to test the Federation's new generation MX mecha? Bai Yulan slowly raised his head. The foot that had been lightly kicking the ground also stepped forward. He stood coldly and looked at Su Lu. After a long time, he said, "Yes. I'm done with my questions." Su Lu didn't ask this delicate man why he was so desperate for money. He only smiled at him and continued to say, "I've become very rich for some reason now. If you need anything, you can ask me. I can take on private jobs, but I don't do things that are illegal," said Bai Yulan lightly, his tone incomparably calm and harmless. At this time, Su Lu already understood Secretary Shen's arrangement. Back when Macho had been negotiating at the back of the mountain terrace, he had suggested that he wanted to observe the development of the new mecha from the closest distance. However, he couldn't show his face in the engineering department, so the other side had actually chosen such an unexpected method to send him to the side of the few people in the Federation who had personally operated the new generation MX mecha. "Of course it's not illegal," said Sulu. "It's something personal. Personal matters are often troublesome matters." Bai Yulan lowered his eyes and looked at Su Li's hand that was covered in the color of detergent. He said slowly, "I can sell my life for money, but I also want to sell it clearly." That delicate pair of hands pulled out of his pocket, a military knife in his right hand. Bai Yulan said in a low voice, "But if you want our team, then this isn't a matter of money. I can't let a young spoiled brat like you drag all 30 of us into a pit." Sulu looked at the delicate military knife in his delicate hand and said, slightly taken aback, "What do you want to do?" Actually, if this sentence had been said by the delicate Bai Yulan, perhaps the scene would have been better. But Bai Yulan only smiled and walked over to him, saying, "If you want to buy Team 7, then at least let me see your true strength. If you're not strong enough, how can you have the right to make such a request?" Sulu was speechless. He still couldn't completely understand the logic of certain people, such as the logic of these Federation soldiers. He looked at the delicate man walking over with the delicate military knife, and could only clench his fists. Chapter 205. I have a nickname, it's called Magnolia Oil. By Magnolia said in a soft voice. That delicate military knife danced between his delicate fingers. The cold light was like a firefly, piercing through the air silently. I joined the army when I was 15 years old. After 10 years of fighting, I know how to operate 134 types of equipment. So in the army, they all think that I'm a veteran. By Magnolia's voice was still very gentle. He was reminding Sulu of something. After all, the other party was the technical supervisor in name. He couldn't really stab him. But there were rules in the army. Even though the 7th team was exiled to the farm headquarters at the edge of the concrete forest, they still had to follow their rules. By Magnolia also felt that this young civilian second lieutenant in front of him was a bit strange. He wanted to know more about him. Sulu narrowed his eyes and stared at the delicate military knife in Bai Yulan's hand that danced like a black elf. He didn't know when Bai Yulan had it in his hand. Listening to these indifferent words, he didn't have any intense emotions. His 2 feet slowly moved away from the cement floor, and the soles of his feet were firmly on the ground. He tilted his head and took a deep breath. His legs quickly shook, shaking up a few strands of dust on the ground. With an incredible speed, he pushed his whole body towards Bai Magnolia. The trembling of his legs was actually because he was moving very fast. It was just that he was moving so fast that it was somewhat dazzling. With a swoosh, the delicate military knife in Bai Magnolia's hand slashed down diagonally. It turned into a stream of light and for the first time, made a terrifying sound. At the same time, Bai Magnolia's pupils shrank. The tip of his leather shoes touched the ground. His whole body arched and he quickly retreated. He knew that Sulu, the technical supervisor, had some problems, so he had to test the other party today. However, he did not expect the other party to move at such a fast speed. More importantly, this speed was accompanied by an imposing aura. Bai Magnolia suddenly felt the danger that could only be felt on the battlefield. Without saying anything, he slashed forward with his arm, but his body retreated, swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Su Li's body seemed to be dodging instinctively. When he started, his legs moved quickly, but his upper body was abnormally stable. At this time, when he rushed in front of Bai Magnolia, his legs seemed to have grown roots. His upper body began to accurately and effectively dodge in a small area. The delicate military knife in Bai Yulan's hand flashed like lightning in the dark space of the armory, appearing and disappearing at the same time. His delicate hands seemed to have some kind of magical power that allowed him to play with an ordinary military knife in his hands, playing with it until it reached a certain realm. With a swoosh, Su Li's clothes were cut open on his shoulder. His body crashed into By Magnolia's arms. His left hand blocked By Magnolia's upper body. Then, with a sneaky second thrust, his right hand went straight for By Magnolia's neck. By Magnolia cried out in a low voice. His right wrist twisted and went under Su Li's left arm. The military knife shone with a cold light. It trembled and emitted a very thin light. It was about to go under Su Li's ear. This move was indescribably fast and ruthless. At the beginning, they did not want to fight to the death. However, By Magnolia's military knife was too cold and dangerous. Su Li had been silent the whole time, but when he attacked, he did not show any mercy. When the two collided, they knew that neither of them were good people. Although they did not fight to the point of anger, at this critical moment, they both felt a chill. Neither of them dared to slow down. Su Li looked at the cold light floating under his chin. His eyes narrowed. He flipped his left wrist and threw it out. It was the ugliest move of the 10 moves that Uncle had taught him. It was like a singer swinging his long sleeves, or a shrew trying to break free from her cowardly husband's hand. Although it was a little ugly, it was absolutely effective. His left arm, which was as hard as iron, directly hit By Magnolia's right wrist, making a loud "pa" sound. By Magnolia did not groan. His face was pale. He kicked towards Su Li's lower abdomen. His right hand, which had been thrown into the air, chopped towards Su Li's forehead. It was as if he wanted to use the cold light to cut Su Li's straight eyebrows into a few inches of dry twigs. Su Li did not pay attention to the military knife coming towards his head. His feet scraped against the ground, and his body moved closer to the retreating By Magnolia. In an extremely short period of time, his left and right hands were like 2 sand hammers, striking towards his opponent's chest. Bam, 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 bam. A series of muffled sounds rang out. By Magnolia's left hand was unable to block the 2 lightning-fast fists. With a muffled groan, the cold light flashed again. He lowered his head, pursed his lips, and a murderous look flashed across his delicate face. With a swish, the cold light on his right hand drew the word 1 in front of him. At the end of the stroke of the last word, the sharp tip of the military knife silently arrived an inch away from Su Li's carotid artery. It was as if a waterfall of blood could come out at any time. Magnolia's nickname in the military was Magnolia Oil. It wasn't just because he was young, but he was already a seasoned veteran. It was also because his former colleagues in the Federation's military were all very clear about the coldness of this delicate man who killed without batting an eyelid, and how slippery the delicate military knife in his hand was. Often, during close combat, the opponent would only notice the eye-catching cold glint in his eyes, but would die under the silent sneak attack of the delicate military knife. When the military knife cut open the carotid artery, the opponent's blood would spray onto his face. It could also spray onto the ceiling like a reverse waterfall. By Magnolia had killed countless people over the years. He didn't know how many enemies he had seen die just like that in front of him. He was a little numb to this kind of waterfall of blood. However, today, he didn't want to kill Su Li, but because of this inexplicable sense of danger, he used his killer move. His right index finger trembled slightly. He was ready to place the military knife on the opponent's weak neck and make the opponent admit defeat. However, at this moment, Su Li's shoulders suddenly rose. His right arm came from the outside and smashed horizontally. A heavy muffled sound echoed in the dark armory. By Magnolia lowered his head. His delicate brows were furrowed. He stood calmly. The military knife in his right hand was slightly stained with blood. His right leg was trembling non-stop. Su Li stood in front of him. There were 7 or 8 slender cuts on his clothes. Only the cut on his shoulder was slowly oozing blood. By Magnolia raised his head and said softly, "What did you eat when you were growing up?" Sulu was stunned. He said, "Beef?" By Magnolia smiled self-deprecatingly. His fingers twirled a flower, and he put the military knife back into the hidden sheath at his waist. He turned around and walked out of the armory. Su Li's last attack had been too powerful. His left arm, which was blocking the side of his face, felt like it was about to break. His right leg, which was supporting him and not falling down, began to tremble. Sweat seeped out of Su Li's hair and dripped onto the wound on his shoulder. Su Lu looked down and couldn't help but shake his head. By Magnolia's attack was indeed cunning and ruthless. If his reaction had been just a bit slower, that military knife would have slit his throat. He just felt a little confused. He fought for no reason and got injured, but he didn't really beat the other party into submission. Could this be the way the Federation's soldiers did things? Su Lu thought to himself. Luckily, he was just a civilian soldier. At the end of the corridor in the Army General Hospital, the glass window was opened. The late spring scent of the garden downstairs seeped in. Su Lu lit a cigarette and smoked in silence. Bai Yulan was leaning against the wall of the corridor with his hands folded in his sleeves, silently looking at the scenery outside the window. His facial features were delicate and his expression was serene. Unfortunately, the bruise on his left cheek and his trembling thigh ruined this picture. Su Lu handed him a cigarette. Bai Magnolia didn't shake his head or accept it. Su Lu squatted down and continued to smoke his cigarette. Thinking of the people he saw in the intensive care unit, his mood became heavy. Bai Magnolia's family was in the intensive care unit. Bai Magnolia was born on planet S2. His parents both worked in the Federation's heavy manufacturing factory. Because of a leak accident, they were poisoned and laid in the hospital. Before we came, I told you that this is a very tacky story. Bai Magnolia looked coldly at the treetops swaying in the spring breeze outside the window. The Federation's government provides medical compensation. It's enough for my parents to lie in the hospital bed until they die of natural exhaustion. But I want them to stay in the best ward. I also hired 6 special nurses, so there's a lot of spending. Su Lu squatted in front of him and used his hand to wipe away the fine bloodstains on his shoulder. The company's salary and benefits have always been good. Plus, you still have a military salary to take. There's really no need for you to take on any private jobs. In the middle of an important mission for the Experimental Federation's new generation of MX-type mecha, the combat supervisor of Team 7 beside him actually dared to take on private jobs. He didn't know whether to say that this delicate man valued money more than his life, or that he was too filial. This has nothing to do with filial piety. Bai Magnolia said coldly, I just like money. I also want to live the best life. I want to wear branded clothes, drive branded sports cars, and sleep with the best women. All of this needs money. Su Lu was silent. He really didn't know what kind of person Bai Magnolia was. At this time, a nurse walked over. Seeing Su Lu smoking, she loudly reprimanded him. Su Lu stood up unabashedly and apologized profusely. He extinguished the cigarette with the tip of his foot. Unable to find the dustbin, he could only pinch the cigarette between his fingers. Bai Magnolia looked quietly at his fingertips. Looking at the extinguished cigarette, he suddenly said, What exactly do you want me to do? Su Lu took out a bank card from his pocket. It was the one Li Xiaotong had prepared for him. Handing it over, he said, There's 20 million in the card. Bai Magnolia was silent for a long time. He was probably shocked by this number. He could be considered a high-income person in the Federation. Adding in the private jobs he had taken on over the years, and the 1.2 million check Su Lu had given him in the afternoon, he had about 5 million in savings. However, his attitude towards money had always been extremely respectful, the more, the better. He took the light yet heavy bank card and said calmly, Deal. Bai Magnolia didn't ask Su Lu what he wanted him to do. For a moment, Su Lu didn't understand what deal meant. Only after a long while did he come to his senses. His eyes gradually narrowed. He understood that this oddly delicate man was saying that he would sell his life to him. Chapter 206. Su Lu used to be very poor. In the first 2 years after he became an orphan, he only ate with Xiao Chang's mother for 2 years. Because of some unknown reason, perhaps because of his innate self-esteem or inferiority complex, he moved out and applied for government aid. He officially joined Li Wei's group of orphans to shop on the streets. He learned a lot from Uncle Feng Yu, but that stingy boss did not have the habit of giving him a salary. He only left behind a bank card after his death. It was from that bank card that Su Lu could be considered to have stepped into the stage of a rich person. His poor childhood did not distort his concept of money. Instead, he increasingly felt that money was just a tool. It was not a goal to strive for. This was not like a lotus flower growing in the mud, but a rock in Donglin, no matter how long it's soaked in the latrine, would still be hard. The stench attached to it would disappear after being washed away by clean water. Because of this concept, the bank card that Uncle Feng left him contained enough money for a normal person to live a normal life. In just a short year, he spent almost all of it. He secretly transferred 1 million to Li Wei, who was far away in Donglin, through the black market. He bought a set of antique simulation equipment from the Shell Motor Company, bought some components, bought flowers, porridge, and biscuits for Zhang Xiaomeng, and bought pancakes, porridge, and women for Tai Ziyuan. How much was left? After leaving Yue University, he started to receive a salary from the Shell Motor Company. He received the riskiest investment in his life from the Li family's 7th young master. Suddenly, Su Lu became a young multimillionaire. Then, he gave away this multimillionaire. Although he did not value money, it did not mean that he did not understand the magic of money in the Federation. That was why he gave the bank card to Bai Yulan. But after that, he realized that he still did not understand Bai Yulan. Could it be that money could really buy a person's life? Ever since the battle at the armory, Bai Magnolia had returned to her usual self. She spoke very little, but she had begun to truly fulfill her duties as a secretary. In fact, she was even better than a full-time secretary. As long as Su Lu did not express any objections, she would stand behind him like a shadow and help him deal with all the complicated matters. He was like a secretary, but also like a bodyguard. However, Bai Yulan did not have much respect for him. She just treated this as a very boring job. Su Lu was not used to Bai Yulan's change, but he had to admit that things were much smoother with Bai Yulan's help. For example, today, when Su Lu decided to take advantage of the 4-day summer holiday in the Federation to rush to Harbor City, Bai Yulan immediately bought a train ticket that was very popular. The people who were on holiday on the train passed through the self-propelled track on the platform and waved goodbye to their relatives and friends on the upper floors with smiles on their faces. Su Lu retracted his gaze from the window and looked at the serene Bai Yulan in front of him. His emotions could not help but become somewhat complicated. Using Li Xiaodong's investment, he had purchased many of the components that Su Lu needed. Right now, the simulation system that he had privately modified was gradually becoming a prototype. Besides this important task, Su Lu had originally wanted to use the data and functional formulas in his head, as well as the design progress of the Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department. Perhaps he would be able to solve the problem of the new generation of mecha in the Federation one step ahead. However, when he truly began to come into contact with this field, Su Lu found that he was just daydreaming. The few prototype mecha that Whitewater Company had been experimenting with in the 100 Mu Triangle Star region had long been towed back to the main company. Even if the Nutshell Engineering Department had been continuously providing feedback through Zhou Yu, and even if Li Xiaotong had invested 100 times more, there was no way that he could solve this problem on his own. Thus, he decided to make a trip to the Federation. The Nutshell Engineering Department was in the suburbs of the most prosperous city in the Federation, and he brought Bai Yulan with him. Developing a revolutionary new mecha did not only require a breakthrough in engineering. Just like the Nutshell Engineering Department's spring recruitment exam question, the mecha was to serve people. More accurately, it was to serve the pilots of the Federation. During the development process, it required the most experienced pilots of the federal military to carry out continuous experiments. The ace pilots of the federal military were most likely working together in the laboratories of the Federal Academy of Science and the Nutshell Engineering Department. Su Lu only had Bai Yulan by his side. Fortunately, Bai Yulan had come into contact with this new mecha before and was familiar with its controls. It was precisely because of this reason that Su Lu had given up on the absurd idea of building the new mecha in the Whitewater Company's base. Instead, like a gamble, he had given all his funds to Bai Yulan. However, he did not tell Bai Yulan the truth, because he did not truly understand this delicate man. Quiet as a virgin, gentle and silent. With a flash of the knife, there was a cold murderous intent in her shyness. How could such a person be so interested in the stench of money? This was the most luxurious soft sleeper compartment on the Beijing high-speed railway. Bai Yulan was indeed a person who treated herself well. Even Su Lu was able to enjoy the high-class treatment. He did not hide his gaze. He curiously looked at Bai Yulan, who was listening to music with her eyes closed. In the post-interstellar era where crystal mines were gradually depleted, space travel, which was very common in the early days of the constitutional era, began to become extremely expensive and luxurious. In this universe composed of galaxies, not every citizen of the Federation had access to advanced technology such as mechas, battleships, and spaceships. Not everyone could freely travel between the stars. Even the citizens who were born in the two recent constitutional era had never left the planet they belonged to. They just silently worked at their respective posts. Other than watching the real-time images taken by the spaceship on Channel 10 or watching the cute purple-haired colonel on Channel 23 lead the Enterprise through the stars, the most likely way for a normal citizen of the Federation to truly set foot in the universe was to join the military. Or rather, it was to voluntarily sign up for the excavation department of a mining company. They would go to remote resource planets to operate machines that did not speak and spend a long and lonely time there. However, the people of the Federation always had a way to solve these mental needs. Since the constitutional era, high-speed rail transit across the surface of the planet had become the most retro and satisfying form of transportation in the writings of writers. That was why Su Lu could see such a busy station. The maximum speed of the high-speed rail had now reached 800 km per hour. There was no problem in using it to maintain the transportation of the entire planet's surface. Although it was still much slower than flying through the clouds, the ticket price was correspondingly much cheaper. Why was the high-speed rail paved with dense magnetic material called the high-speed rail? This was a question that required archaeology. It was said that it was a saying before the catastrophe. Since there was no historical material, no historians were willing to get to the bottom of it. Accompanied by a soft electronic sound, the station and buildings outside the window began to speed up and recede. The radio noise during the startup phase made some passengers who were riding the high-speed rail for the first time find that their portable tablet computer had no wireless signal, and they could not help but complain. Su Lu looked at Bai Yulan again and then looked out of the window again. He looked at the rows of broad-leaved trees in the streets of the capital special district, which quickly flashed past his eyes. Bai Yulan, who was sitting opposite him, took off her headphones and looked at the young man by the window. As a veteran who had been in the military for 10 years, his gentleness and calmness was not only an effective disguise, but also a way for him to find inner peace. However, looking at Su Li's ordinary face, Bai Yulan's heart was not as calm as it seemed on the surface. The 7th Combat Group of the Whitewater Company, which he led, was now in its most difficult period because of the serious mistake they made in the Bermuda Triangle Star region last autumn. Except for him, the members of the group were either sent back to their respective military districts for confinement or were on unpaid leave. He was the only one who remained at the company headquarters calmly. It was difficult to lead a team when the people's hearts were broken. However, if the people's hearts were still there, and the team was gone, there was no need to say anything. After the fight in the armory, Bai Yulan confirmed that this new young technical director might be a little immature, but he was very scary. He knew that he had held back that day, but the problem was that his opponent must have held back as well. Bai Yulan could not even distinguish Su Li's techniques. She only felt that his close combat style was somewhat similar to a certain technique promoted by the special forces in the military a few years ago, except that it was more direct and more ruthless. In addition to his combat strength, Su Li's performance in the next few days also surprised Bai Yulan. This young technical director used a jaw-dropping speed to repair all the equipment in the 7th Combat Group's armory. He even repaired a few large pieces of equipment that were damaged. When Bai Yulan was at the front lines in the West Woods, she had seen many excellent mechanical engineers who were treasured by the military officers. However, she had never seen anyone who could discover problems, judge problems, and solve problems faster than Su Lu. The young man opposite her seemed to have a natural instinct for metal-related mechanical equipment. This should be some kind of talent that could not be replicated. Bai Yulan really could not understand. What kind of medicine did those big shots in the Nutshell Mobile headquarters eat wrong? They actually threw such a genius mechanic into their own Team 7. Unlimited potential, full combat strength, and a lot of money. He was generous like an idiot. His background was mysterious but definitely not simple. Working for such a person was actually not a bad choice. It should be known that in the current federation, it was not so easy to earn money. As Bai Yulan thought about this, she stood up and made a cup of tea for Su Lu. She was an excellent person who did what she was paid. Since she had received 20 million, she did not mind making Su Li's bed and folding his blanket. The high-quality green tea floated gently in the glass and then slowly sank like a spring fog, dyeing the clear water around it. Su Lu turned around and looked at the green tea in the cup. He was slightly stunned. He wondered if Bai Yulan wanted to steal the orderly's job as well. "I'll go to the dining car and bring dinner over," Bai Yulan said softly and then walked out of the room. Su Lu had never been served like this in his life, so it was inevitable that he was not used to it. Bai Yulan walked out of the room and brushed past two youthful girls. Her delicate eyebrows furrowed. The two girls walked to a private room at the side. One of the girls looked a little lonely. In this spring weather, she was wearing a dull black outfit. "Meow meow, open your mind. The dead cannot be brought back. If Park Ji-ho was still alive, he would not want you to live such a sad life." Chapter 207. Meow meow, surname Meow. When her close friends or family members call her by her name, they would only think of the two words meow in their hearts. She was 20 years old this year. It was the season when meow sprouts were growing and swaying in the spring breeze. However, this bunch of meow sprouts were tall and straight. It was always pleasing and not eye-catching. She was now a student in Linhai University, and her other identity was Park Ji-ho's fiancé. The golden-haired Park Ji-ho, although his life was not smooth sailing, he met his nemesis, Su Lu, and stopped abruptly before he had the time to develop his grand plans. But in terms of luck, he was pretty lucky. Park Ji-ho and Meow Meow were family friends. Back then, they worked together in S3 and moved back to S1. According to the old rules, the two families arranged a marriage. Although it was not a terrifying family like the 7 major families, after all, it was still a foundation. Park Ji-ho didn't expect to be free to love. Moreover, Meow Meow was a docile and pleasant girl. Most of his thoughts were on his future, so the two got along well. After the tragedy on Hushan Road, Meow Meow, as Park Ji-ho's fiancé, naturally went to the capital special district. The funeral had just been arranged a few days ago, but the grief in the girl's heart couldn't be erased in such a short time. The elders of the two families were a little worried, so they simply asked for leave from school. Including the summer vacation, a total of 3 months, they let her go back to her hometown in S3 to relax. Today, in the high-speed train carriage, they were heading to the largest airport in Gangdu. Her fiancé had just passed away, so in this late spring, Miao Miao wore a dull black outfit. Her small face was not powdered, and there was a trace of sadness in her pale face. The girl who was traveling with her was called Nan Xiangmei. She was Miao Miao's good friend. They happened to meet in the special district, so they agreed to go to Gangdu together. His relatives might still be sad, and his fiancée might need to spend several years to get rid of this bad news. However, others didn't have so many thoughts. Although they didn't sing and dance together, Nan Xiangmei had never seen the rumored handsome blonde boy. Therefore, when she saw her female companion's sad expression, it was naturally difficult for her to sympathize with her. She could only quietly comfort her and ease her worries. Nan Xiangmei was definitely not a stunning girl. Her lush black hair was casually cut to the side of her ears. She was not as soft as the average long-haired beauty, nor was she as pretty as the short-haired girls. She was just calm, and her facial features also revealed a sense of calmness. If one looked at her carefully for a long time, one would be able to appreciate more and more of her beauty. Listening to Nan Xiangmei's comfort, Miao Miao forced a smile. But when she thought of her fiancé in the cemetery, her heart couldn't help but twitch. She and Park Jigao didn't meet much, but the two of them had the same thoughts. She knew what kind of lofty ambition the blonde man had. Unexpectedly, after 3 months, he passed away just like that. Miao Miao didn't know about Nan Xiangmei's family situation. At this age, no one would talk about their family background. But she knew that her friend's family shouldn't be short of money. And at this time, she was lonely and sad, so she was grateful to have her friend by her side to comfort her. Miao Miao looked at Nan Xiangmei's calm eyes. After hesitating for a moment, she remembered the news that her sister-in-law secretly told her. That news had been suppressed in her heart, and there was no one to ask. Now that she was comforted by her friend, the sadness and anger in her heart suddenly rushed out. She tightly pursed her lips and said, "There is a secret behind Jigao's death." Didn't the district prosecutor's office close the case? Nan Xiangmei was slightly surprised. She looked at her and said softly, "It's just a scapegoat." Miao Miao's face showed a trace of sadness. Jigao offended a big shot in the Federation, so he was killed. Nan Xiangmei quietly looked at her eyebrows and confirmed that her friend didn't start talking nonsense because of the death of her fiancé. She tilted her head and thought for a moment, then said, "Who told you?" "Park Ji-sung." "The elders in the family were worried that I would think too much, so they kept it from me." Miao Miao sadly turned her head and looked at the mountains outside the car window that was covered with a layer of golden sunset. She thought that the sun would eventually rise tomorrow, but what about her lover? Nan Xiangmei softly sighed. After a moment of consideration, she was sure that it was inappropriate for her to say anything at this time. She had no choice but to ask, "Who is so vicious?" "I heard that it was a person who entered the nutshell with Jigao. He entered the research institute, but then disappeared." Miao Miao turned her head and sneered. Bai Yulan shrugged. She carried the tray through the passage and opened the door of the private room. She thought that the sound insulation of the luxurious soft sleeper private room on the high-speed rail was too poor. The two girls inside actually didn't know who to avoid when they talked about murder and arson. The luxurious soft sleeper private room occupied a large area. In addition to 2 comfortable beds, there was also a sofa and a few simple furnishings. Bai Yulan put the tray on the coffee table. She glanced at the big black box under the coffee table and looked at Su Lu. Su Lu nodded. Bai Yulan opened the big black box and pushed it under Su Li's bed. When they left the capital, Su Lu always carried this big box with him. He didn't know what was in the box, but he knew that it was very heavy. She poured a glass of orange juice for Su Lu. Su Lu said thank you. Then the two people couldn't find anything to talk about and began to eat in silence. After the meal, Bai Yulan began to clean up the mess again. Su Lu was bored to death as she watched this delicate man busying himself in and out. For a moment, she couldn't help but have an illusion that she had spent 20 million yuan to buy a maid. How long will it take to get to Hong Kong? Sulu watched the TV for a while and suddenly asked. Just now the broadcast said that there was a flash flood along the Nuizhou. Although it didn't affect the line, it is estimated that it will take about 10 hours to get there because of the Federation's disaster relief train. Bai Yulan softly replied. Sulu shook his head. The summer holiday was only 4 days. He had to secretly enter the Nutshell Engineering Department, so he could only use the holiday. Time was a little tight. If he didn't worry that the big black leather suitcase wouldn't pass the Federation's airport security check, he would never take the high-speed train. According to Bai Yulan, the luxury soft sleeper ticket was actually much more expensive than the plane ticket. Go one carriage in the A direction, there is a special bar. Bai Yulan said. Oh, since we have nothing to do, let's go walk around. Sulu asked for his opinion. Bai Yulan had finished cleaning up and quietly replied, I don't have any opinion, but I want to remind you of one thing. Park Ji-ho's fiancée lives next door. Sulu was stunned. He looked at Bai Yulan and gradually narrowed his eyes. The Hushan Road incident happened a long time ago. He knew that there were probably not many people in the Whitewater Company who knew about his relationship with that incident. Since Secretary Bai reminded him, he must know the inside story very well. How did he know? I have to find out who I am working for. Bai Yulan lowered his eyes and said softly, Don't worry, as long as you don't violate the Federation's laws, I don't care if you are the son-in-law of the Deputy Minister of National Defense. I only care about money. Since he knew that Park Ji-ho's fiancée was on the train and lived next door, Sulu certainly wouldn't go to the bar to kill time. Although he did have a hobby of drinking now, if he really met a widow who was drowning her sorrows in alcohol, he really didn't know what would happen. After all, that widow's fiancé was killed by him. Sulu didn't have any psychological burden when he killed Park Ji-ho. Even the Hushan Road incident was just a matter of seconds. However, he didn't want to meet the relatives of the deceased. When he was spat on by Park Ji-ho's younger sister in the district prosecutor's office, although it didn't dry up, he didn't feel angry. He just silently wiped it away. Park Ji-ho's fiancée probably didn't know him, let alone know that he killed Park Ji-ho. However, Sulu didn't take the risk. It wasn't until late at night that he walked out of the compartment and walked to the lounge at the end of the train. He sat on the sofa in the corner and looked at the whistling night outside the window. The curved and decelerating glass windows made the scenery outside clear but not dazzling. The air noise caused by the high-speed train was also reduced to a minimum. He lit a cigarette and thought about the girl who was not far from him. He thought about Park Ji-ho's stunned and desperate expression under the knife at Hushan Road. He frowned slightly. In the dim light, a girl walked over and sat on the sofa not far from Sulu. Smoking was allowed in the lounge. 3 single sofas were placed in a triangle. The designer probably meant that there were only 3 luxurious sofa compartments on the train. Sulu, who was sitting in the corner, saw the girl coming and thought about what he had been thinking. The cigarette in his hand trembled, and the ashes fell on his knees. He looked a little embarrassed. He hurriedly tried to put out the cigarette. No, my family often smokes. I'm used to the smell. Nan Xiangmei looked at the young man in the corner with a smile. She didn't secretly guess the identity of the other party. Although it was strange that the other party was staying in a luxurious compartment at such a young age, it was just that she misunderstood Su Li's action of putting out the cigarette. She somewhat approved of this person's attentiveness and didn't want to be nosy. She was not used to riding in such a luxurious compartment. Although her family definitely didn't care about the cost, she only came here to accompany her friend. The sleeping compartment at night didn't shake much, but she was still more used to riding the old-fashioned train alone in her early years. That kind of shaking felt real. The lounge was very dim at night. After Sulu heard the girl's words, he silently took back his hand that was putting out the cigarette. Looking at the calm smile on the girl's face, Sulu knew that the other party should not be the widow that he didn't want to see. His mood was slightly relieved. People who met by chance on the journey might strike up a conversation or remain silent. At this time, the man and woman on the sofa were silent. The dim light didn't mean that it was ambiguous. The corner was darker. Su-lu quietly looked at the girl. The girl was wearing a plain dress, and her whole body exuded a sense of peace. At first, he didn't feel anything, but the more he looked at her, the more he could see the beauty of her face under her black hair. When he was in Donglin, he liked to look at the few beauties on the street. When he was a gatekeeper, he also saw many youthful bodies. With just a few glances, he found that this girl was outstanding. Chapter 208. The girl not far in front of him had a beautiful face. Her black hair gently covered her ears. There was a trace of calmness that could not be disturbed. It was pleasing to the eye, but it was only pleasing to the eye. Su-lu may not have reached the age where he could truly appreciate the beauty of the opposite sex, but he could feel that the other party was outstanding. However, this kind of excellence had nothing to do with him. His current state of mind had really been beyond the word lust for a long time. Previously, when he was nestled in the corner of the sofa, thinking about the widow on the other side of the wall, the reason why he silently smoked was because he remembered the state of mind when he learned of Zhang Xiaoming's death. Vaguely, he could roughly understand the pain of Park Ji-ho's fiancée at this time. Under certain circumstances, the joys and sorrows of human beings should be interconnected. Young people's first love encountered the most unbearable encounter in the world. Su-lu was young, but as Li Xiaotong once said, there was a trace of loneliness in the old house. Love gradually drifted away from him. After several trips with Li Xiaotong and seeing the flattering attitude of the young stars, he did not even have the mood to play along. To get rid of this state of mind, he needed time, or another girl who could enter his heart. The light was dim, and the sound outside the window was light. The beautiful girl sat quietly beside him. Unfortunately, it was not that time, so Su-lu just kept silent. After an unknown period of time, the train suddenly slowed down. Su-lu woke up from his half-awake state and subconsciously looked out of the window. He saw a large area of lights in the distance of the plain. It should be a big city. He immediately thought that this should be the only stop on the way of the Beijing High-Speed Railway, the capital of South Kazhou. At this time, Nan Xiangmei, who was sitting in front of him on the sofa, was also awakened from her slight tiredness. She looked out of the window. Their eyes met on the glass that reflected the scene inside the carriage. At the same time, they were stunned. Nan Xiangmei rubbed the slightly curled thick black hair below her ear and smiled at Su-lu on the glass. Su-lu smiled and nodded, but still did not say anything. Su-lu felt for the cigarettes in his pocket and put the box on the coffee table. He took out a cigarette, lit it, and took a deep breath. He didn't know if it was because he clearly felt that the beautiful girl next to him was staring at him, but he actually didn't know what to do and coughed twice. Nan Xiangmei looked at him curiously. The two of them had been sitting in silence for at least an hour. They didn't say a word, but there was always some lingering curiosity. Especially at this time, the coughing sounds in the quiet car were so clear. Her pair of clear eyes overflowed with concern. Su-lu was a little embarrassed. He felt that it was not appropriate to stay here any longer. He reached for the cigarette box and prepared to leave. At this moment, the carriage stopped at the platform and the door opened. There should be passengers boarding the carriage. Su-lu was slightly surprised and turned his gaze to the corridor. There were only 3 luxurious soft sleeper compartments in this carriage. He and Bai Yulan occupied one. Park Ji-ho's fiancée and the beautiful girl in front of him, who he didn't know the name of, occupied the other one. The other one had been empty. But the problem was that it was only a few hours away from Harbor City. Could there be people coming on the way? While he was stunned, the uninvited guests had already passed through the corridor and directly came to the lounge. The 3 sofas occupied a large space. Su-lu wanted to go out at this time, but it was not convenient. Bai Yulan suddenly came to the corridor and stepped on the side of the carriage. She slightly lowered her head and was as quiet as usual. Seeing Bai Yulan suddenly appear, and then seeing the two people in front of him, Su Li's heart slightly moved. He withdrew his hand from the cigarette box and carefully hid behind the sofa, hiding his face in the darkness. Generally speaking, it was used to describe a spring breeze, or a little girl who missed her brother, or a little girl who only met 3 months ago. It was rarely used to describe two big men. However, the two passengers who had boarded midway gave Su Lu, who was sitting on the sofa, a strong feeling. He even felt that if these two passengers were willing, they could carry the cold wind of winter in Linhai. Although there were only two people, the footsteps that seemed to trample on people's hearts were like thousands of soldiers and horses marching over. Among the two people, the one who walked in front was about 30 years old. His facial features were ordinary, but there was a sense of grace in his calm eyes. His shoulders were straight, but because of the gray coat, there was a sense of steepness. Under the guidance of the train attendant, this person did not enter his compartment, but went directly to the lounge. He walked so naturally that if he wanted to, everything in front of him should make way for him. When this man walked past Bai Yulan, he did not even look at her. Walking behind this man was a big man. He was 1.9 meters tall and was not far from the ceiling of the carriage. He had a shiny bald head, and a tattoo drilled out from his back, spreading along his neck to the back of his head. Under the dim light, it was impossible to see what the tattoo was, but it was probably a somewhat ferocious flower in full bloom. He was supposed to be an extremely oppressive man, but behind the 30-year-old man in front of him, he deliberately restrained his aura and tried to be as calm as possible. But when he followed the man through the corridor and passed by Bai Yulan, he inconspicuously turned his head to look at the delicate man. Bai Yulan still had her head lowered, as if she did not feel anything, but her right foot that was pressing against the wall of the carriage slid down a few inches. Su Lu had a natural instinct for danger. Although the two men in the car didn't show any malicious intent, he could feel that they were strong. He didn't know what kind of strength they were referring to, but seeing Bai Yulan, who was sleeping in the private room, quietly come to his side, it was enough to prove something. The ordinary-looking man sat on the only empty sofa in the lounge, and the bald tattooed man naturally stood behind him. The train slowly moved away from the capital of South Kazhou. The waiter saw that the distinguished guests in the luxurious compartment did not seem to be sleepy, so he resisted the tiredness and politely served them a few cups of tea and 2 plates of snacks. The man was sitting on the sofa in a relaxed manner. He did not drink tea, but looked at the pack of cigarettes on the coffee table. Suddenly, he leaned over and picked it up, saying, "Good cigarettes, can I have one?" "You're welcome." The man's voice was not magical, but it was low and gentle, and somewhat pleasant to the ears. Su Lu said, and at the same time, handed over a lighter. Nan Xiangmei had been sitting quietly on the sofa. She really did not want to spend the night in that luxurious compartment like a luxury hotel. Previously, when she saw that the passenger who got on the train went directly to the lounge, she thought that he was someone Su Lu knew, but now she knew that she was wrong. She could not help but look at Su Lu in confusion. For some reason, Su Lu seemed to be able to understand the meaning of this beautiful girl, and he shook his head with a bitter smile. At this time, the sofa in the lounge was full. A bald tattooed man with a height of 1.9 meters was standing behind the man like a bodyguard. The delicate secretary was resting with her eyes closed in the corridor next to the lounge. The scene was somewhat strange. Nan Xiangmei also noticed this. She stood up, politely nodded to Su Lu, and was ready to go back to the room to rest. The unknown man sitting on the sofa suddenly smiled and said, "Miss Nan Xiangmei, I specially came to see you, would you do me the honor of saying a few words?" Nan Xiangmei looked at the man seriously and curiously. She had to admit that although this man was obviously over 30 years old, he was not handsome, but his temperament was really attractive. What made her unable to leave immediately was that this man actually called her name. Did he really come here to see her? Su Lu, who was sitting in the corner, heard the words Miss Nan Xiangmei, and his heart couldn't help but tremble. Nan Xiangmei was a somewhat strange surname, but there were many people with this surname in the Federation. But the problem was that there were not many Miss Nan Xiangmei who could afford to live in a luxurious soft sleeper compartment. For Miss Nan Xiangmei to be specially visited by this man, there was only one possibility. One of the 7 major families in the Federation, the Nan Xiangmei family. In the dim light, a self-deprecating smile appeared on Su Li's face. Unexpectedly, he could meet the miss of the Nan Xiangmei family on a casual trip. It seemed that he, an insignificant person, was really at odds with one of the 7 major families in the Federation. After a moment of daze, he was more interested in why the middle-aged man sitting on the sofa, who was obviously not an ordinary person, would choose to visit a beautiful girl who was so peaceful that no one could bear to disturb her in the middle of the night in a high-speed car. "Excuse me, who are you?" Nan Xiangmei looked curiously at the man on the sofa, as if he was not worried about her safety at all. "I was familiar with Nan Xiangshou in the past." When Nan Xiangmei heard this, she felt relieved. The Nan Xiang family had a very strict upbringing. Apart from true friends, very few people would know their real names. Since the other party could call out her brother's real name, he shouldn't be lying. "I have always heard that Miss Nan Xiangmei is a very outstanding woman." The man on the sofa looked at Nan Xiangmei gently. There was no superfluous emotion in his eyes, only endless admiration and pity. "Seeing you today, it is indeed so." Upon hearing this, Nan Xiangmei couldn't help but blush. She wasn't a person who was easily embarrassed, but for some reason, the praise from the man on the sofa was like the verdict of a certain professor in the Federation, giving the listener endless confidence. Am I really an outstanding woman? Thinking of this, she could not help but feel a little shy. Su Lu looked at the dark red color under Nan Xiangmei's white earlobes and could not help but be slightly startled. "Dohai is not good enough for you." The man on the sofa suddenly said seriously, "This marriage is called off." Hearing this sentence, Nan Xiangmei was shocked and immediately guessed the real identity of the man on the sofa. Among the 7 great families hidden in the shadows of the Federation, marriage was a very common thing. Once the parents of both sides decided, no one could stop it. Nan Xiangmei also could not escape this fate. However, at this moment, a strange man suddenly got on the train in the middle of the night, praised her with full of pity, and said that he wanted to call off the marriage. Among the 7 great families, probably only this person could ignore the authority of the elders and break the marriage between the 2 families with just a sentence. Nan Xiangmei slowly stood up with a trace of disbelief and looked at the man on the sofa in a daze. In the hearts of the children of the aristocratic families, this man in front of her was already a legend, and deeply respected. "Thank you." Su Lu was an outsider. He did not know Nan Xiangmei, and it was impossible for him to know who the man on the sofa was. So, he did not understand this conversation at all. He only felt that Miss Nan Xiangmei, who was silent in the middle of the night, seemed to be happy from the bottom of her heart. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.